Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Field of Orbs in Oklahoma. It was a quiet evening in rural Oklahoma, the kind where the air feels thick with the promise of an ending day. The golden hues of the sunset stretched across the vast plains, the sky bleeding into oranges and reds that seemed to go on forever. It was a peaceful kind of beauty that many people take for granted, at least, I did. The open road before me, the lonely stretch of highway, felt familiar in a comforting way, as though I had driven it 1,000 times before. I was on my way home after another long shift at the diner, the tires of my old truck humming steadily along the asphalt. The radio had long since given up, static filling the silence, but I didn't mind. I preferred the quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dry grass along the roadside, the kind of wind that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. But that evening, something felt different. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you sense something dangerous, but more like an odd pressure in the air. Like when the weather changes, but you can't yet tell how. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the sensation off, but it lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. As I drove, the field stretched out on either side of the road, endless, rolling plains where the land seemed to hum with the secrets of the earth. Nothing ever really happened out here. People didn't come to this part of Oklahoma for excitement, they came for the space, the solitude. But tonight, even the emptiness felt heavy. A flash of light caught my eye, just at the edge of the horizon. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the sun glinting off something in the distance. But then I saw it again, this time more clearly, a strange, glowing orb hovering above the field, just beyond the dirt road. I squinted, unsure if I had seen it at all, or if it was some trick of the fading light. I slowed the truck instinctively, staring into the distance, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. My heart skipped a beat as the orb pulsed, flickering like a dying ember, before disappearing entirely. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. For a moment, I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. It was probably nothing. A trick of the mind, or some natural phenomenon I couldn't explain. But as I glanced at the empty road ahead, I knew I couldn't just keep driving past it. The pull of curiosity tugged at me. And so, I turned the wheel and guided my truck toward the dirt path that led into the fields, where the glow had just vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there, something I wasn't quite ready to face. But I was already moving forward, and there was no turning back now. As I drove further down the winding dirt road, the evening sky darkened around me, the last rays of the sun slipping away behind the distant hills. The field stretched out endlessly on either side, the tall grasses swaying gently in the breeze. My headlights cut through the gloom, but there was still that strange, unsettling feeling in the air, like something wasn't quite right. I had almost convinced myself that it had all been a trick of the fading light when I saw them again, more of them, appearing on the horizon, hanging just above the field. The orbs. But this time, there were at least half a dozen, glowing with an unnatural intensity. They weren't just flickering like before, they were burning with an almost steady, fiery light, hovering in midair like miniature suns. I slowed the truck, unsure of what to make of them. They seemed so out of place, so wrong. The field was supposed to be empty at this hour. There were no structures out here, no buildings, just the open land and the occasional farmhouse miles off in the distance. No one else seemed to be around, and the road ahead was silent. No other vehicles, no animals, no sounds other than the soft hum of my engine. The lights, fireballs, I thought to myself, moved slightly, but slowly. They bobbed in the air like balloons caught on a gentle breeze, their fiery glow casting strange, shifting shadows across the ground below. I could make out the faintest outline of the field where the light touched it, but the orbs themselves were still too far away for me to get a good look. They pulsed, as if they had a rhythm, like something alive. I found myself staring, entranced by them. The air seemed to thicken as I watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to look away, to tell myself they were nothing but reflections or some natural phenomenon, but the sight was too hypnotic. They almost seemed to beckon me, like they were waiting for me to come closer, to discover what they truly were. I leaned forward in my seat, squinting as I tried to get a better view. The glow was brighter now, and they were closer than they had been just a moment ago. The way they floated, silent and almost weightless, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't normal. It couldn't be. There was no logical reason for me to stop. I knew that. But still, I found my foot pressing gently on the brake, slowing the truck even further. The road ahead wound into the dark expanse of the field, and for a brief moment, I considered driving past, ignoring what I had seen. But my curiosity got the better of me. What were they? What could they be? I took a deep breath, the cold air rushing in through the cracked window, and made the decision. I was going to get closer. Just a little closer, to see if I could make sense of what was happening out here. So, I turned the wheel, veering off the road and onto the worn dirt path that cut through the field. The truck jolted as it hit the uneven ground, but I didn't care. The lights were waiting for me, drawing me in. As the truck bumped along the uneven path, I tried to shake the strange sense of dread that had settled over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The lights had to be something simple, something I could explain away. Maybe they were just reflections, the last of the sunlight bouncing off some distant metal object, or maybe even the headlights of another car far off in the distance, their beams distorted by the mist rising from the field. Yeah, that's it. A trick of the light. Nothing more. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the truck's tires crunched through the gravel. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept drifting back to those lights. They were too bright, too persistent, to be anything as simple as a reflection. And they didn't behave like headlights. No, these things hung motionless in the air, bobbing and pulsing like they were alive. Maybe it's some kind of atmospheric phenomenon? I thought, trying to reason with myself. Strange lights in the sky, maybe the result of weather conditions or something to do with the electrical fields of the area. I had heard of people seeing strange things out here before, mirages, odd glows at twilight, or even fireflies that seemed bigger and brighter than usual. I wasn't the first person to be spooked by a strange light in the middle of nowhere. But as I watched them, moving slowly but surely across the field, that voice of reason inside me started to sound quieter. Something wasn't right. The orbs were too still, too controlled. They weren't dancing with the wind or drifting like clouds. They were hanging, hovering, as if they were waiting. No, I couldn't be thinking like this. I had to stay rational. This was just some random oddity of nature. The lights were far off, maybe just an odd reflection from a passing car or a trick of the wind. I had been driving for too long, maybe the exhaustion was getting to me. After all, I had a long day at the diner, and the heat of the truck cabin wasn't exactly helping with my focus. I let out a breath and tried to push the unsettling thoughts out of my mind. There was nothing to worry about. No reason to be afraid of a few strange lights in the distance. I wasn't going to let my imagination run away with me. I was a grown adult, after all, and I wasn't about to be spooked by a few glowing dots in the sky. Yet, even as I tried to convince myself, my hands tightened on the wheel. The lights, they weren't just strange, they were otherworldly. The longer I watched, the more I could feel something deep inside me stirring, a recognition, an ancient fear that I couldn't quite place. It was like the ground beneath me was shifting, and everything I thought I knew about the world was beginning to unravel. I shook my head. No. I couldn't let this go any further. I was rational. I could think logically. This was just an unusual sight in an otherwise empty landscape. Nothing more. Still, despite the words I told myself, my heart quickened. The lights didn't fade. They stayed in place, glowing and pulsing in the gathering darkness. And as I continued driving toward them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just lights. They were something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to understand. I was too close now. Turning back felt impossible. My foot hovered over the brake pedal, the truck rumbling beneath me as I drove closer, closer to the lights. A nervous energy crackled through my body, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to drive away before it was too late. But I couldn't. Curiosity had taken hold of me, and there was no shaking it off. The lights had become brighter now, each orb pulsating like a heartbeat, an eerie rhythm in the dark. They almost seemed to draw me in, pulling me toward them, as if they knew I was watching. There was something hypnotic about their glow. Despite the chill creeping up my spine, despite the growing sense of wrongness that gnawed at the edges of my mind, I couldn't stop myself. I had to see them up close. I had to know what they were. I parked the truck a few hundred feet from the closest orb, the engine still running as I sat there for a moment, staring at the glow. The field around me was empty, quiet, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the tall grasses. The air smelled faintly of earth, dust, and something sharper, like the ozone before a storm. The faint hum of the truck's engine seemed to compete with the growing pulse of the lights, a strange synergy between the two, like the hum was somehow connected to the orbs themselves. I shook my head. It was all in my mind. They were just lights. Nothing more. I tried to convince myself of that as I opened the door and stepped out of the truck. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, the dry earth cracking slightly with each step I took toward the field. The orbs hung motionless ahead, their glow now casting an unsettling light across the land. The closer I got, the more I could feel my pulse quicken, a sense of unease rising in my chest. What the hell was I doing? I stopped for a moment, looking back at the truck. The engine hummed softly in the background, the headlights illuminating the edge of the field. The world around me felt so still, so silent, and for a moment, I thought about getting back in the truck and driving away. But the pull of those lights, that strange, magnetic presence, was too strong. I couldn't leave without knowing. I took another step, and then another. My shoes crunched on the dry grass, the sound disturbingly loud in the quiet night. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step I took, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me. The lights ahead were no longer distant, they were right there, close enough for me to see their true shape. They looked like fireballs, glowing with an intense, unnatural light, but their edges were perfectly smooth, as if they were made of something other than fire. They floated above the ground, hanging just a few feet in the air, but they didn't sway or drift like balloons caught in the breeze. They were still, silent, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I drew closer, the sensation of dread creeping up my spine. I reached out instinctively, but stopped myself just short of touching them. I didn't know why. I hadn't even thought about it until now, but the thought of touching one of them, it filled me with a deep, primal fear. Something told me that if I reached out, something would happen. Something I wouldn't be able to undo. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the orbs. They seemed so familiar, and yet so alien, like they didn't belong in this world. The quiet of the field was oppressive now, every whisper of wind magnified in my ears. I glanced around, but the field was empty, stretching out in every direction, no other signs of life, no signs of anything. I took another step forward, despite the unease growing within me. The orbs were right there now, within arm's reach. And yet, they seemed so distant. The silence was broken by a sudden rustle in the grass behind me, sharp and quick, like something had moved. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing. Just the empty field, the night pressing in around me. I exhaled shakily, my heart racing. I was being ridiculous. It was just a noise. The wind. Still, my eyes darted nervously around the field as I stepped even closer to the closest orb. The pull to touch it was undeniable, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I did, something would change, something I wouldn't be able to escape. But I couldn't stop. I had to know. I reached out a hand, slowly, hesitantly, toward the glowing ball of light. My hand hovered just inches from the closest orb, trembling slightly as I fought against the intense unease clawing at my insides. The light seemed so inviting, glowing warmly against the cold darkness of the field, but I could feel something deep in my gut telling me that this was wrong, that whatever they were, they weren't meant to be here. They weren't meant to be seen by anyone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill crept down my spine. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, unwilling to move. It was as if the orbs were drawing me in with a force stronger than my own will. I couldn't explain it, but I felt their pull, deep, irresistible. They were waiting for me. They weren't just lights, not like I had thought before. They were alive. I could almost feel them watching me, studying me, like they knew exactly who I was and why I had come. The world around me seemed to dim as I leaned forward, drawn by an invisible tether that seemed to tighten with every step I took. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere around me had changed. The usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of animals in the grass, had fallen away entirely. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, beating loudly in my ears. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as I took another step forward, then another. The light from the orbs was brighter now, and as I approached, I could see the faintest distortion in the air around them. It was as if reality itself was warping, shifting in strange patterns, the edges of the orbs rippling like water. I blinked, trying to focus, but the sight only intensified the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled deep in my chest. I wanted to turn back. I should turn back. I should be running, sprinting back to the truck, away from whatever this was. But the light, it was so beautiful, so mesmerizing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Another step. My breath caught as I reached the orb, now so close I could feel the heat radiating off it. But it wasn't fire, not like I had first imagined. It was more like warmth, comforting warmth that contrasted with the chill of the evening air. And yet, it was wrong. Nothing in nature should glow like this, should hum with this strange, unearthly energy. I stretched out a hand, my fingers tingling with anticipation and dread. But the moment I touched it, a shock rippled through my body. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, like an electric jolt running through me, waking something deep inside me that I didn't understand. My vision blurred, and I staggered back, instinctively pulling my hand away. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake, that the light had burned me, or that I had somehow triggered some kind of trap. But as I looked at my hand, I found it completely unharmed. I glanced back at the orb, now even more vibrant, almost blinding in its intensity. It felt like the entire field had shifted around me. The silence was suffocating now, the air heavy with a tension I couldn't shake. And then, to my horror, I realized I wasn't alone. I hadn't heard anything at first, but now there was a sound. Soft, faint at first, like whispers carried by the wind. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, rising in pitch. The whispers swirled around me, the words unintelligible, but they seemed to come from all directions, filling my ears with a cold, otherworldly pressure. And as the whispers grew louder, I noticed something else, something far more terrifying. The shadows around the field were moving. At first, it was just the usual play of light and dark, but now the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, growing longer and more defined, as though they were alive. My breath quickened. I turned quickly, looking around for anything familiar, any sign of safety. But all I could see were the orbs, now more numerous, casting their unearthly light over the empty expanse of the field. They seemed to have multiplied, growing closer, as if they were closing in on me. A wave of panic rose in my chest, my legs frozen in place, as though the very air had turned to stone around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the orbs were controlling everything around me, trapping me here with their glowing eyes, their silent, unblinking gaze. And then, from somewhere deep inside, I heard it, just a whisper at first, but growing louder, more distinct. "Come closer." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even real in the way that I understood it. It was something else, something that belonged here, something that was calling me. With a sudden, uncontrollable impulse, I took a step forward, my body moving on its own, against all reason, against everything that screamed at me to run. The orbs, with their beckoning light, were pulling me in. And in that moment, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was no longer in control. The fear inside me had turned into something else, something deeper, darker. I wasn't just looking at the lights anymore. I was being drawn to them, and nothing in the world could stop it. I don't know how I moved forward. I should have turned around. I should have run back to the truck, slammed the door shut, and driven away as fast as I could. But I didn't. I couldn't. My feet, as if guided by some unseen force, carried me deeper into the field, each step heavier than the last. It felt as though I was walking through molasses, the ground beneath me almost pulling at my feet, urging me to keep going. The orbs, once distant and solitary, were now everywhere. They hovered in the air, pulsing with an unsettling intensity. They were no longer just glowing lights in the distance, they were alive, each one shifting in a way that made the very air around me feel charged with something unnatural. The colors of the orbs were shifting, too. What had once been a soft orange glow now flickered between shades of red, yellow, and an eerie, deep violet. It was as if the lights were drawing energy from the darkness, feeding off the empty space of the field, growing stronger the further I went. The air around me felt thick, charged with a tension I could taste on my tongue. Each breath I took felt shallow, and the more I inhaled, the more I could sense the weight of the world pressing down on me. The familiar sounds of the countryside were gone. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling of leaves in the trees. It was like the world had fallen silent, as if the orbs had consumed everything around them. I tried to focus, tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that this was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But the overwhelming sensation of wrongness only grew stronger with every step. The light was blinding now, so bright it almost hurt to look at them. I squinted, my vision swimming as I watched the orbs shift and pulse in eerie harmony. The further I went, the more they multiplied. What had started as a few scattered lights now seemed to cover the entire expanse of the field. They didn't move in random patterns either. No, they seemed to be following some kind of choreography, as if they were aware of me, responding to my presence. I forced myself to stop, looking around at the countless orbs now surrounding me. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized how deep into the field I had ventured. The truck was nowhere in sight anymore. The familiar landscape of the road, the open fields, everything was gone, swallowed up by the glowing lights. I had no idea how far I had walked, or how long I had been moving. It felt like time had stopped, like I had crossed over into a place where time and space didn't obey the rules I knew. My thoughts felt distant, like they were coming from someone else, someone who wasn't quite sure what to do or where to go next. The fear I had felt before seemed to be fading, replaced by something else, something almost soothing, as if the lights themselves were whispering to me, urging me to stay, to accept what was happening. I couldn't. I had to move. I had to leave. But then, something changed. A low hum filled the air, barely perceptible at first, like the sound of distant thunder. It wasn't like any sound I had heard before, though. It wasn't natural. It was deeper, vibrating in my bones, and as it grew louder, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shudder. I blinked, my thoughts racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the nearest orb. It was too close now. The pull was undeniable. My fingers twitched as I instinctively reached out toward it, drawn in by its unnatural light. Before I could stop myself, I was moving again. Closer. The hum grew louder, more urgent, as if the orbs were somehow communicating with me. I could feel it now, the presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, settling into my chest like a heavy stone. There was something alive here, something ancient and powerful, and it knew I was here. I forced my hand to hover just above the orb, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from it, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. But it felt inevitable, like something inside me was waiting for that moment, for the touch, for the connection. Something that had always been here, in the field, in the shadows, watching, waiting for me to finally step into its grasp. The hum grew louder still, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else beneath the sound, a voice. Low. Whispering my name. I froze. But when I looked around, the field was empty again. The orb seemed to hang in place, still, silent. There was no voice, no sound other than the hum. Just the vast, oppressive quiet. I took a step back, trying to breathe, trying to regain control of my thoughts. But my feet felt heavy, like they had been cemented into the ground. The lights kept calling to me, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Come closer. The words echoed in my head. The hum filled my bones. And as I looked around, I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no going back. I had walked too far into the unknown. I had stepped onto an unfamiliar path, and I didn't know if I could find my way out. I should have known. I should have turned back the moment the hum began, but my body refused to obey. My feet, still unwilling to stop, carried me forward into the heart of the field. The orbs, now a swarm of glowing lights, pulsed with a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too alive to be anything natural. The air around me was thick, almost suffocating, and every breath felt more like a struggle, as though the very atmosphere was pushing against me. Then came the sounds. At first, it was subtle, just a faint crackling, like dry leaves crunching underfoot. But it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from the air, swirling around me, as though the wind itself was trying to speak. The crackling grew louder, sharper, until it sounded almost like static, like the sound of a broken radio, its frequency shifting and warping in ways that felt unnatural. My heart raced as the sound seemed to bend, its tone rising and falling in a disorienting pattern, like something was trying to break through the static, trying to be heard. I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I instinctively looked around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, only the shifting orbs and the oppressive stillness of the field. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from or why it felt so wrong. It was like the wind itself had a voice, one that was too distorted, too broken to understand. And then, above the crackling, I heard something else. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a soft breath of air, a sigh in the night, but the words, it sounded like words that scraped across my mind, faint and indecipherable at first. My blood ran cold as I strained to listen, my mind working overtime to make sense of it. Come closer. The whisper wasn't just in my ears, it was in my mind, like a voice inside my head, so close that it felt as if it had come from the air itself, pressing in around me. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a figment of my fear, but it didn't matter. The voice was there, pulling at me, calling to me. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a shiver down my spine as it howled through the grass, swirling around me in sharp, frantic gusts. The crackling sound increased in volume, now accompanied by a faint rustling, like whispers in the breeze, soft and secretive. They were words, soft, broken words, impossible to understand but impossible to ignore. I strained my ears, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out what the whispers were saying. It wasn't language I knew. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. It was a strange, foreign sound that seemed to come from all directions, from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very wind was alive with voices. I turned, trying to see past the veil of shadows around me, but the glow of the orbs only made the darkness deeper. The wind picked up again, this time strong enough to make the grass sway, its rustling now a distinct rhythm that mirrored the crackling sound, blending into one unsettling melody. The whispers were louder now, their urgency growing, like something was trying to break through. Leave. The words, though faint, were clearer this time. The voice wasn't friendly. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, distant, almost as if it came from far away, from some dark, unreachable place. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart hammered in my chest as the wind began to howl, rising in pitch until it felt as if it would tear through the very fabric of reality itself. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps, and looked around again. The orbs, they weren't just glowing now. They were shifting, their light pulsating more erratically, faster, almost violently. The shadows around me twisted and stretched, long, unnatural tendrils reaching out from the darkness as if something was trying to emerge from them, something not of this world. The wind shrieked in my ears, but it was no longer just wind. It sounded like voices, thousands of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, a cacophony of whispers, crackles, and wailing. The static, the crackling, it wasn't just in the air, it was in my head now, reverberating through my skull, pounding against my thoughts. Come closer. The whisper returned, insistent, this time so close, so sharp that I could feel it deep inside me. It wasn't just a voice, it was calling to me. And the moment the words reached me, something in the field shifted. The orbs, all of them, began to pulse with a new energy, brighter, hotter, more alive than ever before. Their glow burned into my retinas, and the air around me crackled with an intense charge that made my skin tingle. The fear I had felt before, the sense of unease, it was gone now, replaced by a kind of dread so deep it felt like my very soul was being pulled toward the lights. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run far away from this place, but my body didn't listen. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward toward the center of the field, where the orbs grew so close that their light began to distort the air around me, bending and warping reality itself. Come closer. The wind howled again, the voices louder now, rising in urgency, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't fight it anymore. The call was too strong. It was no longer a question, no longer a plea. It was a command. And as I moved closer, deeper into the heart of the field, I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't just walking into the light. I was walking into something else. Something waiting for me. The closer I got to the orbs, the more I felt the weight of their presence pressing down on me. My body moved forward as if it were no longer mine to control, each step carrying me deeper into the field. The glowing lights loomed ahead, their shifting pulses almost hypnotic, their colors swirling in an unnatural dance. I could feel the hum vibrating through the air, resonating in my chest, but as I moved closer, something else caught my attention. I stopped suddenly, my breath catching in my throat. Something was wrong with the ground beneath me. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, long, dark streaks cutting through the grass, stretching across the field. But as I squinted, the shape became clearer. The trail wasn't just random, it was purposeful. Something had been walking through the field, leaving behind an unmistakable path. The blades of grass were bent, crushed, and pressed into the earth as if something or someone had passed through here recently. I crouched down, my hand trembling as I traced the edges of the trail. The ground felt colder here, the earth hard and compacted beneath my fingers. The grass was flattened in a perfect, deliberate line, the path winding through the field in a steady direction, almost like a road. But it wasn't natural, it was far too neat, too precise, like a trail that had been carefully carved out, step by step. I glanced around, the crackling sounds still buzzing in the air, the hum of the orbs louder now, as if they were aware of my discovery. The trail stretched ahead, weaving between the glowing lights, disappearing into the deeper darkness. I should have turned back. I should have pulled myself away from this path and left the field, but curiosity gnawed at me. What had left this trail? I moved forward again, my steps cautious now, my senses heightened. The trail seemed to be growing clearer as I followed it, the bends and turns more distinct, more purposeful. The ground here was eerily still, the air heavy with the weight of something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, someone, was close. I pressed on. The trail was leading me toward the center of the field, closer to the orbs, their glowing light more blinding with every step. As I approached, I noticed something else about the path. It wasn't just the grass that had been disturbed. The soil itself had been scraped, torn up in places, as though something heavy and powerful had passed through. There were deep grooves in the earth, faint imprints of something that didn't belong here, something that didn't walk like a human. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the center of the trail, where the orbs hung closest. I stopped, my gaze drawn to a strange indentation in the ground. It was circular, as if something had been resting here. The edges of the mark were uneven, almost jagged, like a huge weight had pressed down into the earth, leaving a permanent impression behind. And then, I noticed the most unsettling detail of all. The air around the indentation seemed to shimmer. It wasn't just the glow of the orbs, it was something else, something subtle but unmistakable. The shimmering air flickered in waves, like a heat haze on a hot day, but it wasn't the temperature that made me shiver. It was the feeling it gave off, an oppressive, suffocating sense of something unnatural. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't just a trail. It wasn't just a mark in the field. It was something else. The deeper I looked, the more I felt that there was an invisible force at work here, one that had carved this path for a reason. My thoughts raced, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. Was this a warning? A sign? Or was it something worse, a signal, perhaps, that whatever had created the trail had left something behind, waiting for someone to find it? I didn't know the answers. All I knew was that the orbs were now closer than ever, their pulsing light growing more intense, more urgent. The crackling sound, that strange static, filled the air again, now accompanied by a soft whisper that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Follow the path," it breathed. It was a voice, soft and distant, as if it were coming from the orbs themselves. The command was clear. The words, "Follow the path," echoed in my head, and without realizing it, my feet began to move again. Something deep inside me screamed to stop, to turn around, to run back to the truck, to get as far away from this field as possible. But I couldn't. The pull of the trail was too strong. It was like the path had chosen me, and there was no going back. I followed the trail. With each step I took along the strange trail, a creeping sensation began to settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the eerie glow of the orbs that unnerved me anymore, nor the strange whispers that seemed to swirl around me with every gust of wind. It was something far more primal, something deeper. It was the feeling of eyes on me. I couldn't shake it. No matter which way I looked, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, I felt as though I was being watched. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you think someone might be looking at you from a distance. This was different. This was suffocating, like there was something, or someone, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I stopped again, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the field around me. The tall grass swayed with the wind, and the orbs continued their erratic dance, casting long shadows that stretched and warped in the fading light. Everything seemed the same, nothing had changed, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, had intensified. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and forced myself to keep moving. My legs were shaky, reluctant to carry me forward, but my feet kept moving, step by step, as if they had a mind of their own. The trail in front of me grew more pronounced, more defined, and I couldn't ignore the way the ground seemed to draw me in, urging me onward. And then the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, a chill that crept over my skin, but it wasn't normal. The evening was warm, the sun barely slipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It should have been a comfortable evening, a gentle transition into night. But instead, a coldness began to settle over me, thick and unnatural. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it did nothing to quell the growing chill. The air, once warm and still, had become heavy, pressing against me like something solid. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it was as if the very atmosphere had changed, as if it had become thick, dense with a cold that wasn't natural for this time of day. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, no longer just in the wind, but in my head, too. The static, the crackling sound, it was in the air, surrounding me, pressing against me from every direction. "It's almost time," the voice murmured, almost lovingly, but its tone held an undertone of something dark. It was the kind of voice that sent chills crawling up your spine. The kind that made your skin prickle with warning. I stumbled, my foot catching on the uneven ground, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The cold was too strong now, pressing against me, sinking into my bones, and the feeling of being watched had turned into something much worse. It was close, whatever it was. I could feel it, just on the edge of my senses, lurking just out of sight, breathing the same air as me, watching my every move. I looked around frantically, trying to see if there was anyone or anything hiding in the shadows of the field. But there was nothing. The orbs continued their erratic dance, casting an unsettling light on everything they touched, but there was no movement, no sign of life beyond the unnatural glow. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I hurried forward, my steps growing faster, more frantic. The wind howled around me, cold and biting now, tugging at my clothes, pulling me toward the center of the field. The orbs were now blinding in their intensity, their pulsating light distorting the world around me, turning it into something surreal, something that didn't quite feel real. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath in the air, faint puffs of white smoke escaping my lips with every exhale. The setting sun, once a comforting warmth, now seemed distant, insignificant in the face of this unnatural cold. Something was wrong, terribly, terribly wrong. As I drew closer to the center of the field, where the orbs swirled and pulsed in their hypnotic dance, the cold became unbearable. It felt like a living thing, something that had taken root in the very air around me. I could feel it in my lungs, in my skin, as if it was trying to enter me, to suffocate me from the inside out. And still, the whispering voice lingered, repeating the same words over and over, growing louder with each passing second. "Come closer." I stopped. The air was freezing now, impossibly cold for an evening like this, and I felt my body shaking, not just from the chill, but from a deep, primal fear that was sinking into my very bones. It wasn't just the cold that terrified me, it was the feeling that something was about to happen. Something I couldn't control, something I couldn't stop. I was not alone in this field. And whatever it was not happy with my presence. It was watching, waiting, calling me closer. But I couldn't move. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and sprint away, back to the truck, back to safety. But my feet refused to obey. The feeling of being trapped, of being caught in something I didn't understand, held me in place like a vice. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, this time almost soothing, like it was coaxing me into the unknown. The cold, the fear, the pressure around me, it was too much. And then, just as my body was on the edge of breaking, I heard it, louder than the whispers, louder than the crackling static. A footstep. A single, deliberate footstep in the grass behind me. My heart stopped. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was there, something close. And it was no longer hiding. I froze. The air around me seemed to still, the wind dying down to a complete silence. My heart hammered in my chest, my blood roaring in my ears, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The feeling of being watched, no, followed, was overwhelming, suffocating. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I could feel it. Something was right behind me. I could almost feel the weight of its presence, breathing down my neck. I stood completely still, my body frozen in place, waiting for a sound, a movement, anything. But there was nothing. The only noise was the steady, distant hum of the orbs and my own rapid breathing. Then, it happened. A cold pressure pressed down on my left shoulder, sharp and sudden. The sensation of fingers, icy and strong, gripping my skin, sending a shock of terror straight through me. My blood ran cold, a wave of panic flooding my chest. My legs almost gave out beneath me, and for one terrifying moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the spot. A touch. I could feel it. Someone, something, had touched me. But when I turned to face them, there was nothing. Nothing but the empty expanse of the field. The long grass swayed gently in the wind, the orbs pulsated in the distance, and the only sound was my own shaky breath echoing in my ears. I spun around quickly, my body on high alert, expecting to see something, or someone, looming behind me. But there was no one there. The path behind me was empty. The field stretched on in the fading light, just as it had before. I stood, frozen in place, my heart pounding like a drum. The touch had been so real, so solid. I had felt it. There was no mistaking it. But now, looking around, I saw nothing. Just the same twisted landscape I had been walking through for what felt like an eternity. A part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, a nervous reaction to the growing sense of dread. But deep down, I knew better. I had felt that pressure on my shoulder. I had felt the fingers dig into my skin. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had touched me was still here, still watching, still waiting. I took a step back, my breath coming in quick gasps, my mind racing for a logical explanation. But none came. The reality around me felt wrong. There was no way to explain it, no way to reason with what I was experiencing. I couldn't trust my senses. I couldn't trust the air, the ground, the whispers that still echoed faintly in the background. Everything felt off. I turned my head to glance behind me once more, the fear gnawing at my insides, but there was still nothing. The field lay in front of me, empty and silent. The orbs were still there, floating just beyond the horizon, their pulsing glow a strange beacon that pulled me deeper into the unknown. And yet, despite the emptiness before me, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was standing right behind me. It was as if the field itself had become a living thing, its very presence bending around me, touching me, without me ever truly seeing it. The coldness had returned, more intense than before, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, the air thick with the sense that something unseen was watching me, waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel the pressure building inside my chest, like I was suffocating. The invisible force pressing in on me felt too real, too close. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I started to turn to leave, my foot caught on something in the grass, sending me stumbling forward. I caught myself just in time, but the moment of disorientation made the fear spike again, sharper and more frantic. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. "Come closer," they urged, more forceful this time, like a command. The voice was no longer soothing. It was sharp, almost desperate. It was a demand, pulling me toward the center of the field. My legs refused to obey as my body fought the urge to run. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to take another step forward into whatever darkness waited beyond the glowing orbs. But I had no choice. The path called me. The air pressed against me. Whatever had touched me was still out there, waiting. And I couldn't escape it. With trembling hands, I forced myself to take one step forward. And then another. The fear surged in my chest like an electric current, but I kept moving. There was no turning back now. The field, the orbs, the unseen presence, they were all pulling me in deeper and deeper. And I couldn't fight it anymore. Whatever was watching me was closer than ever, and I felt its presence as if it were woven into the very fabric of the air around me. I was no longer alone. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my breath shallow, my body trembling from a mix of fear and cold. The orb in front of me, the orb, was unlike any other. It was massive, hovering just a few feet off the ground, its eerie glow casting long, distorted shadows on the earth beneath it. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like the heartbeat of something alive, something far older and darker than anything I could comprehend. I felt its presence long before I was close enough to touch it. The air around it was thick with an unnatural energy, like static that buzzed under my skin, pulling at my very cells. The closer I got, the more the world around me seemed to disappear, as though the orb was drawing in everything around it, distorting reality itself. The grass beneath my feet was flat, pressed down as though something heavy had passed through recently, but I could no longer hear the sounds of the wind or the distant rustling of trees. There was only the sound of my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest, the rhythmic pounding growing louder and faster with every step. And then, there was the faint hum of the orb, the sound vibrating through the air, filling the space around me, vibrating through my bones. I stopped a few feet away, mesmerized, yet terrified. I had to force my legs to stay rooted to the spot, unwilling to go closer but unable to look away. It was as if something inside me was pulling me toward it, urging me to move, to cross that invisible line into its orbit. Every inch I came closer, the more intense the glow became, bright and harsh, blinding my vision in waves of pulsing light. For a brief moment, I wondered if it was an illusion, some trick of the light, some strange atmospheric phenomenon that had distorted my senses. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen too many strange things already. This was something beyond explanation. It was something ancient, something wrong. I stepped forward again, this time more slowly, each movement deliberate. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and the ground felt different now, almost spongy, like I was walking on something that was no longer quite solid. As I neared the orb, I could feel the air grow colder, but not in the usual way. It wasn't the kind of chill you'd expect from evening air. No, this was deeper, unnatural, as if it were seeping through the very fabric of the world itself, chilling my skin, my thoughts, and my soul. The cold was wrong. I wanted to turn away, to leave this place behind, but something inside me kept urging me on, pushing me closer to the orb's hypnotic light. And then, just as I was about to reach out to it, something shifted. The orb flickered, its glow dimming for a brief moment before flaring brighter than before. It didn't just glow. It saturated the air, drowning everything in a light so intense it felt like it was burning through me, through everything around me. My eyes stung from the sudden brightness, and I raised a hand to shield them, but it didn't help. The light was all-encompassing, turning the world around me into a bright, oppressive void, leaving only the orb and its unrelenting radiance. A deep, throbbing hum filled the air, so low it rumbled in my chest, vibrating through the ground beneath me. It was as if the orb was alive, breathing, pulsing, watching, waiting. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light faded. The humming stopped. The world snapped back into focus, but it was different. Something had changed. The air felt heavier now, thicker, and the weight of its presence was unbearable. I took a cautious step forward, my heartbeat erratic, my mind swirling with questions I had no answers for. What was this thing? What did it want? And why was I drawn to it? Before I could react, I felt the temperature drop sharply once more. The cold didn't just bite at my skin, it sunk into me. It crawled under my flesh, into my bones, sending a shiver of terror down my spine. I couldn't breathe properly, as if the very air had become too dense, too heavy to take in. Then I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the orb, from within it. A voice, calm and deep, but impossibly cold. It was as if the sound itself was made of ice, cutting through my thoughts, invading my mind with words that weren't words at all, just intentions. Come closer, it whispered. The voice was not physical, it was inside my head, as though the orb itself was speaking directly to my thoughts. But it wasn't a request, it was a command, a beckoning, an invitation into something I couldn't understand. My body trembled, my feet unwilling to move closer, yet I couldn't tear myself away. The orb called to me, beckoning me into its light, into its warmth. But I knew that once I crossed that line, I would be lost. I would never come back. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body betrayed me. My feet took another step forward. The orb pulsed once more, brighter than before, and the air crackled with a strange energy, like the world itself was holding its breath. The whispering voice was louder now, clearer, and the words, though unintelligible, felt like they were pulling at the very fabric of reality. I stood there, trembling, caught between the terror of what I felt and the inexplicable pull of the orb. What was it? What did it want from me? And before I could take another step or even make sense of my thoughts, I felt something else, a sudden shift, a pressure from behind. It was coming, and it was too late to turn back now. My breath caught in my throat. The voice, no, the presence that seemed to radiate from the orb was overwhelming. It filled my mind, threading through every thought, every fear, and every flicker of curiosity. It was as if the orb knew me, knew my deepest impulses, and used them against me. The more I tried to resist, the more its pull intensified, drawing me closer to it. I could feel my fingers twitch, as if they had a will of their own. The chill in the air wrapped around me tighter, biting at my skin, but it wasn't just the cold that made my stomach twist into knots. It was the magnetic pull of the orb itself, its call that sounded like a whisper just beyond the edge of my understanding, yet it felt as if it were seeping into my very soul. My body was caught between two forces, a primal need to flee, to run from the terror of the unknown, and the overpowering desire to approach, to know what lay at the heart of this eerie, glowing thing. It was both an attraction and a dread, a magnetic force that twisted my insides. The terror gnawed at me, warning me to stop, to turn away before it was too late. Yet, curiosity, no, something deeper than that, pushed me forward. I couldn't help it. My hand moved before I could think, before my mind had a chance to protest. My fingertips brushed against the glowing surface of the orb. The moment my skin made contact, the world around me seemed to freeze. I couldn't feel the wind anymore. The buzzing hum of the orb was gone. There was no sound. No movement. The orb was cold, colder than anything I had ever touched, colder than the air itself. But it wasn't just cold in the way you'd expect. It was unnatural, like touching something that didn't belong to this world. It was wrong. As soon as I made contact, an icy shock ran up my arm, a jolt that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. It was as if the orb had latched onto me, holding me in place, not physically, but somehow, mentally. I felt my pulse quicken, the sensation of being pulled deeper into something I couldn't comprehend. The light from the orb intensified, the glow swelling around me, surrounding me like an invisible cocoon. It wasn't blinding, but the light was everywhere, filling every corner of my vision, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to twist and distort the world around me. I couldn't see anything but the orb and the harsh light it exuded, as though the rest of the world had faded into nothingness. Then, the whispers returned. "Louder now!" "Come closer," the voice urged, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was an insistent, almost desperate command, pulling at the deepest parts of me. I felt like I was being drawn into a current I couldn't fight. The urge to step forward, to give in, was overwhelming. I could almost feel its presence pressing against my chest, pushing me to move. My fingers, still touching the orb, seemed to sink deeper into it, as if it were a liquid or some other substance I couldn't understand. It wasn't hard, wasn't solid. It was like touching air, but dense, alive, in a way that made my skin crawl. A jolt of pure energy surged through me, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like I was being torn apart from the inside out, my mind splitting open, my body fraying at the edges. The air around me was thick, as if the orb itself was suffocating me with its presence. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me shifted. My feet, no longer steady, slipped as the earth seemed to warp and bend. The orb, pulling at me with increasing force, felt like the center of some vortex. Everything was spiraling toward it, the field, the sky, even the light. It was all closing in, narrowing down to the point where I stood, where I touched it. I opened my mouth to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came out. My voice was lost in the blinding, suffocating light that now seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. The sense of reality, of being in the world I knew, was slipping away, as if I were no longer connected to anything tangible, anything real. The fear, the terror, it was all consuming. I tried to pull my hand away, but it wouldn't budge. It was like my skin was glued to the orb, and the more I struggled, the more it seemed to tighten its grip on me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my body trembling, but my mind was gripped, frozen in place, unable to break free. And then, suddenly, sharply, everything stopped. The light dimmed, the pressure on my chest eased, and the grip on my hand disappeared. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my pulse racing as I yanked my hand away from the orb, finally free. The world around me snapped back into focus. The orb hovered in front of me, its light now muted, no longer the blinding force it had been just moments before. But something was different. Something had changed. I couldn't place it, but I felt it deep inside me, a subtle shift in the world around me, a feeling that something had broken, something irreparable. I stood there, panting, my heart still hammering in my chest, my hand trembling at my side. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had just touched, whatever I had just encountered, was not just some strange phenomenon. It wasn't just some freak of nature or an illusion. It was something alive. Something that had been here long before me, and something that would be here long after. I was no longer just curious. I was terrified. But it wasn't over. I had touched the orb. And now, whatever was inside it knew I was here. And it was coming for me. I staggered back, my hands still burning from where I had touched the orb, and my mind was reeling. The world around me felt off, distorted, as though I had stepped into some kind of twisted reflection of reality. The air was heavier now, thick with an unnatural weight, and the shadows seemed to stretch in ways they shouldn't. Everything, from the dirt beneath my boots to the trees in the distance, felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. I took a shaky step backward, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the orb. Its glow had faded, but the draw it exerted on me was no less powerful. In fact, it was stronger now, like a gravitational pull that anchored me in place, rendering me motionless. My body wanted to run, wanted to escape, but my feet refused to move. I couldn't look away. And then, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was loud, clear. Like a heavy weight pressing against my skull, the voice invaded my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, forcing its way into the deepest corners of my consciousness. It was cold, far colder than the air, and filled with a strange urgency. Stay away. The voice was not my own. It felt alien, foreign in a way I couldn't describe, yet its presence was unmistakable. It wasn't human, but it was unmistakably aware of me. A chill ran through my spine, and I immediately froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The voice continued, but this time it wasn't just a command. It was a plea. Leave now, before it's too late. You don't know what you're dealing with. I tried to think, to make sense of what was happening, but it was hard to concentrate. My head felt foggy, like something was clouding my thoughts. The orb pulsed gently, its light flickering, almost as if it were responding to the voice. But despite the voice's warning, despite the surge of terror coursing through me, I couldn't move. The orb had a grip on me, something stronger than fear. It was compelling me. Why? Why do you want me to leave? My voice felt hollow, weak. I didn't even know if I said the words aloud or if they were just thoughts floating in my head. It didn't matter. The orb seemed to hear me regardless. The response came immediately, sharp and direct. It will consume you. It has consumed others before. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught again, and a sickening cold settled deep in my chest. What did that mean? Who else had it taken? The thought that I wasn't the first to be lured here, to fall into the trap of the orb, sent a ripple of horror through me. I suddenly felt small, like a speck of dust, insignificant against the vast, unrelenting force of whatever this orb was. Leave, the voice screamed in my mind, and this time there was no mistaking the panic, the desperate need to drive me away. But despite the terror that gripped me, despite every fiber of my being screaming to flee, my body refused to listen. The orb called to me, louder now, its pull an almost physical force that pressed against my chest, forcing me to move forward. It was irresistible. I didn't want to go closer. I knew I shouldn't. But somehow, I took another step toward it. My body moved as though it were no longer my own, as though some unseen force was guiding me forward, drawing me in with an intensity that drowned out all reason. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the heat of the orb on my skin, even though I knew it was cold, almost impossibly so. The warmth radiated from it in waves, burning through the air, filling every inch of space with a terrifying intensity. The voice was louder now too, but it was distant, like a memory fading as I crossed that invisible line toward the orb. You don't understand. You cannot go back once you've crossed this threshold. The words were softer now, but the urgency had not diminished. It was too late. And then, as if everything around me had suddenly stopped, I felt the pull intensify, like a grip around my heart. I had crossed the line. I was too close now, and there was no turning back. I could feel the orb drawing me in, closer and closer, its light pulsing with an eerie rhythm. I tried to stop. My legs were shaking, my body trembling, but my feet wouldn't listen. I reached out again, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the orb. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. Only an overwhelming need to connect, to understand. And the moment I touched it again, everything exploded. The ground beneath me trembled, and I was pulled. Not physically. No, it was something far worse. I was being drawn inward, into the orb itself. I felt my body stretch and compress, as if reality were warping around me, folding in on itself. The voice screamed one last time in my mind, but it was drowned out by the overpowering hum that rose from within the orb. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The world was spinning, twisting, and in an instant, I was no longer standing in the field. I was somewhere else. Somewhere far beyond anything I had ever known. The sensation was so overwhelming, I couldn't even comprehend it. I wasn't sure where I was, but one thing was certain, I had crossed a point of no return. And now, I was trapped. The orb had claimed me. The moment my hand made contact with the orb, everything changed. At first, I was overwhelmed by a rush of warmth that spread through my fingers, up my arm, and into my chest, as though I had just stepped into sunlight after hours of cold. It was so sudden, so intense, that I almost gasped in relief, as though I had been waiting for this feeling, this sense of comfort, for far too long. For a split second, I almost forgot about the terror, the warnings, the whispers. I let my hand rest against the orb, feeling the heat radiating from it, pulsing with a rhythm I couldn't explain. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that it was just some strange but harmless phenomenon, something that could be easily explained. Maybe it was some kind of natural energy or an unknown weather pattern. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the warmth disappeared. It was replaced by something far worse. A wave of cold crashed over me, plunging through my body like an icy blade. The warmth turned to frost in an instant, and my skin erupted in goosebumps. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had frozen in time. My breath came out in white puffs, each exhale sharp against the biting cold. I felt my fingers stiffen, my arm freezing where it still made contact with the orb, as though the orb had turned the very air into ice. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling, the deep, gnawing sense of wrongness that washed over me. It wasn't like standing in winter or getting caught in a snowstorm. This cold felt unnatural. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It felt as though it was cutting into my very soul, as though it was reaching deep inside, chilling something within me that had nothing to do with the external temperature. I yanked my hand back, but the cold lingered, clinging to my skin. The orb pulsed again, its light flickering like a dying star, but the warmth was gone. The very air around me felt frozen, as though time itself had slowed, stretching every moment to unbearable lengths. My heart pounded faster, not just from fear, but from the desperate need to escape this feeling, to escape the orb's hold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything felt wrong. I turned away from the orb, stumbling back, but the cold pressed in closer, following me like an invisible force. The world around me began to blur, the edges of everything growing hazy, as if the very reality I stood in was starting to dissolve. It wasn't just a change in temperature. The cold, the darkness, they felt alive, as though they were watching me, closing in around me. There was something intelligent about it. Something aware. The orb itself seemed to have reached deep inside me, manipulating the world around me, pulling the strings of this reality like a puppet master. I staggered back, my feet unsteady, my breath shallow and rapid. I tried to focus, tried to ground myself in the physical world, but everything felt so distant, as though I were floating in a void. My head was spinning. My thoughts were scattered, like leaves in the wind, unable to settle. I was on the verge of panicking, of losing myself entirely. And then, without warning, a voice broke through the cold. It wasn't the voice from before, the warning voice. No, this was something else. This voice was closer. It was familiar, even though I didn't know it. It filled my head, not with words, but with feelings, with images. The orb was showing me something I couldn't fully grasp. I saw flashes, visions, of a place, a world, a realm beyond the one I knew. Shapes and colors twisted in strange patterns, too fast to focus on, too strange to understand. But I felt them. I felt the enormity of whatever it was, the vastness of it, and yet the emptiness, the hunger that lurked there. A sudden, visceral awareness flooded me. The orb, whatever it was not just a passive object. It was alive. It was watching me, pulling me closer to something far worse than anything I could imagine. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet refused to move. My body was numb, as though it had been frozen by the orb's cold grip. I couldn't tear my gaze away, even as my heart raced with terror. The air crackled with a low and the orb's light flickered again, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The cold continued to invade my bones, crawling deeper, turning my insides to ice. But through the cold, through the fear, I could hear it, the softest of whispers, as if the orb were speaking directly into my mind. You are mine. The words echoed inside my head, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just a warning. It was a claim. A terrifying, final claim on me. The orb had taken something from me, something I didn't understand. And I had no idea how to take it back. Everything was slipping away. I couldn't move. The cold had wrapped itself around me so tightly, so completely, that I felt frozen in place. My mind raced, but my body was numb, as though I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The orb hovered before me, its pulsating light now so intense it blurred my vision. The air around me shimmered, vibrating with an unnatural energy, and I felt my legs start to give way beneath me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand. And then, suddenly, everything changed. A blinding flash of light exploded from the orb. It was like the sun had burst into the sky in an instant, a flash so brilliant and overwhelming that it consumed everything. There was no warning, no gradual build-up. One moment, the world was suffused in that eerie, unnatural glow, and the next, the orb unleashed its fury. I didn't have time to react. The light engulfed me entirely, swallowing up everything in its path, my vision, my thoughts, even my very existence. It was so intense that I couldn't even tell where the light ended and I began. It wasn't just light, it felt like energy, pure and unrelenting, a force that seized me, pulling me into its core. I could feel my body trembling, my muscles locking up, as though I were being torn apart from the inside out. And then, silence. The flash was gone. The overwhelming light disappeared in an instant, leaving behind an eerie stillness. For a brief, horrifying moment, I was lost. I couldn't tell where I was, what had happened, or even who I was. It was as though time itself had been suspended, stretched thin, leaving only a void. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. But then, as suddenly as it had come, my senses returned. I collapsed to my knees, my body aching as if I had been struck. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to steady myself. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, and yet, the cold that had gripped me was gone. The oppressive heaviness in the air had lifted, and the world seemed normal again. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe the orb had just been a trick of my mind, some strange hallucination brought on by the isolation, the fear. But no! I could still feel it, that strange pull. It was still there, lingering, just out of reach, like a distant echo of something terrible. Something that wanted to claim me. I tried to push myself to my feet, but my body felt weak, almost foreign, as though I were no longer in control. My vision was blurry, and my mind was still hazy, disconnected from the reality around me. My legs were trembling, and my stomach churned with a deep, gnawing unease. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The field was the same, stretching out in all directions, the same familiar land I had walked through just moments before. The sky was dimming, the last traces of daylight fading beyond the horizon, and yet it felt different. The air was still. The trees in the distance, the rolling hills, everything seemed too still, too quiet. Like the world itself was holding its breath. I wiped my face, and my fingers came away wet. Was it tears? Sweat? Or something else? I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to know. The sensation of something crawling just beneath my skin was overwhelming. It felt like I wasn't alone. Something was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I stood up shakily, glancing around the field. The orb was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace of the light, nothing but the endless stretch of grass and the fading sky. But I could still feel its presence, like a shadow that wouldn't leave, a memory that I couldn't shake. I didn't understand what had just happened. I didn't understand why I was still alive. My head pounded with questions, but no answers. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or something far worse? I couldn't stay here. Not with that feeling lingering in the air. I needed to leave. To escape. But no matter how much I willed my body to move, I couldn't make myself take that first step. My feet were rooted to the ground, my mind clouded with fear, uncertainty, and a sinking feeling I couldn't shake. I had touched the orb. It had changed everything. And now I had no idea how to go back. I woke up with a jolt, my eyes snapping open, heart racing. I was lying on the ground, cold and damp beneath me. My mind was foggy, disoriented, struggling to piece together what had just happened. The flash. The light. The cold. The orb. My chest tightened as I tried to sit up, but my body felt strange, uncooperative. It was as if I had just woken from a long, deep sleep. But this wasn't sleep. This wasn't a normal awakening. I pushed myself up slowly, my arms shaking from the effort. The ground felt softer than it should have, the grass beneath me swaying, moving, almost as if it were alive. My vision blurred for a moment, the edges of everything distorting in a sickening way, and I forced myself to focus. The sky above me was not the familiar twilight I remembered. It was pitch black, a deep, oppressive darkness that stretched endlessly above. There were no stars. No moon. Just a vast, empty void, And the air was thick, almost like it was pushing against me, heavy with a strange, humming resonance that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't the calm, familiar evening air of Oklahoma anymore. This felt wrong. I could feel it in my chest, in my skin. The atmosphere itself seemed to pulse with something I couldn't name, something unnatural. I staggered to my feet, disoriented, and looked around. The field, it was wrong. It was the same, and yet, not. The tall grasses that should have been golden and soft now twisted into dark, jagged shapes, sharp and unnatural, curling like the fingers of something lurking beneath the earth. The ground seemed to stretch on forever, rolling in waves like some terrible dreamscape, and the trees, if you could even call them that, stood like blackened skeletons, their gnarled limbs reaching toward the sky in grotesque, twisted formations. I took a step forward, my feet crunching on the brittle earth. The strange hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground itself, sending shivers up my spine. It felt like the world was alive, watching, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the field was different, not just in appearance, but in essence. The very air, the ground beneath me, felt alien, foreign. Like I was no longer in the world I knew, but somewhere else. My mind raced. Had I died? Was this some kind of afterlife? Or was this something worse? Something far more terrifying? I reached for my pocket, instinctively searching for my phone, but there was nothing. No phone. No keys. No evidence of the world I'd known. It was as if everything had been stripped away the moment that flash of light consumed me. I took another unsteady step, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I tried to gather my thoughts, to piece together some rational explanation, but nothing made sense. My thoughts felt jumbled, like they were slipping away, as though this place was slowly erasing everything I knew, bit by bit. The humming intensified, coming from every direction, vibrating through the air and the earth beneath my feet. It was a sound I could feel deep in my chest. A sound that was alive, like the beating of a heart. But it wasn't a heart I recognized. It was cold. Empty. I turned in a slow circle, trying to take in my surroundings, but the landscape seemed to shift, to warp, every time I looked away. It felt like I wasn't in the same place, but in a mirror, a twisted reflection of the field I had just been in. The trees, the grass, the horizon, they all shifted with every glance, like the world itself was in flux, a constantly changing riddle. And then, something in the distance caught my eye. A faint, flickering light, far away across the field. I squinted, trying to focus, but it was too far to make out. The light pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, and then it vanished, only to reappear a moment later in a different spot. My heart skipped a beat. The orb? Or something else? I could feel my body tremble, but it wasn't just from fear. It was something deeper, something primal. A part of me, some small, terrified part of my mind, wanted to turn and run, to flee from this strange world. But another part, a darker part, felt drawn to the light, pulled toward it as if it were calling me. It was impossible to ignore. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened to me, it was inescapable now. And as much as I wanted to fight it, as much as I wanted to turn back and escape, I couldn't. There was no turning back now. I took a deep breath, pushing the fear down as best I could. The light in the distance beckoned, and despite the gut-wrenching feeling that something was terribly wrong, I felt compelled to move toward it. Something inside me, something deeper than logic or fear, was urging me forward, urging me to uncover whatever this world was. I had no choice but to follow. I took a tentative step forward, but something about the ground beneath me felt wrong. My boots sank deeper into the earth than they should have, as if the ground itself were softening, pulsing with a strange, slow rhythm. It wasn't just the soft texture, it was the way the earth moved, subtly shifting beneath my feet as if the very soil was alive. My senses screamed that I wasn't in a normal place anymore, that something here was fundamentally different. I pulled my foot free with some effort, looking down at the ground, my pulse quickening as I saw it. The dirt wasn't brown and dry like it should have been. No, it glowed faintly, an eerie, pale green that shimmered like the reflection of something hidden deep below the surface. It wasn't a natural light. It was too wrong. I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my boots, thrumming into my bones, almost like it was trying to reach me. But it wasn't just the ground. The trees around me, those twisted, gnarled remains of what I once thought were familiar oaks, had become something far more grotesque. Their trunks were thick, jagged, and dark, like blackened bone, jagged knots and ridges running up their sides. The branches reached upward, but they didn't stretch toward the sky. No, they twisted inward, as if drawn by some unseen force, curling into unnatural spirals, their tips contorted into sharp, jagged claws that seemed to point at me. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I scanned the trees. They looked like they were watching me, silent sentinels in the distance, standing at the edges of the field, their twisted limbs writhing in the air like living things. The leaves, what little there were, weren't green or even yellow. They were black, as if scorched by fire, their edges curling and flickering with an iridescent light. I blinked and shook my head, trying to make sense of it, but the more I looked, the less real it felt. The very nature of the landscape was bending, warping before my eyes. The field stretched on, but now it seemed to breathe. The ground beneath me pulsed, as though it were alive, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the unsettling hum that filled the air. I stepped forward again, my boots crunching softly on the earth, and as I did, I noticed something else. The sky. It wasn't just dark, it was oppressive. The inky blackness of it pressed in, closer and closer, as though the very air were thickening. I felt a weight on my chest, the sensation that I was being suffocated by the space around me. There were no stars. No moon. Just the endless void above, stretching farther than I could comprehend. It felt like something was waiting up there, watching, listening, but not in the way of a simple storm or a passing cloud. This was intentional, and I could feel it deep within me. A presence. A gaze. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, the rhythmic pulse of the ground seeming to match it, as if we were both in sync, tied to the same slow, terrifying tempo. I glanced around, looking for something that made sense. Anything familiar. But the longer I stood there, the more everything seemed alien. The wind had stopped, there was no rustle in the trees, no sound of birds, no hum of insects. Just that eerie pulse beneath my feet and the oppressive silence that seemed to wrap itself around me. I took another step forward, more out of instinct than desire. The light in the distance still flickered, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat I could almost feel through my own chest. Whatever it was, it called to me, and with each passing second, I felt it pulling me closer. But before I could take another step, something caught my eye. A shape, fleeting and strange, moving in the corner of my vision. It was small at first, barely a blur against the distortion of the trees, but then it stopped. My body froze, every muscle tensing as I turned to look more closely. In the distance, where the twisted trees grew thickest, I saw something, or someone. A figure, draped in shadow, standing motionless between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form hunched slightly, as if it were waiting, watching. And yet, there was something about the figure that was wrong, unnatural. It seemed to flicker, shifting in and out of focus, like a broken image, fading in and out of reality itself. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart began to pound faster, echoing in the hollow space around me. I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't friendly. It wasn't human. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, fading into the shadows of the trees like smoke. I stood frozen, my body tense and still, too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to even breathe. I could still feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make my next move. But I couldn't afford to stop now. The light, that strange, beckoning light, it was still calling to me. And despite every instinct in my body telling me to run, I couldn't ignore it. The pulse of the ground, the flickering light, they were pulling me forward. And I had no choice but to follow. The moment the figure disappeared, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, deeper than anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just the fear of something unknown, but the realization that everything around me was wrong. I wasn't just in a strange version of the field anymore. No, this place, it was something else entirely. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't deny the gnawing truth settling into the pit of my stomach. I had crossed into something else. A different dimension. A parallel reality. Something far darker than I could comprehend. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I staggered back, my hands trembling. The strange humming sound, the warped landscape, the dark sky, it all felt like a nightmare, like a twisted reflection of the world I knew, but magnified 1,000 times. How was this possible? How had I ended up here? What had those orbs been? What had I touched? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. I couldn't see a way out. There was no sign of the road I had driven on, no sign of the truck that had been parked just moments ago. I was alone. Alone in a world that didn't belong to me. The air was thick and suffocating, and every sound seemed amplified, vibrating through my body like a pulse, like the very essence of this place was alive and aware of me. I took another step forward, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. It didn't matter how much I tried to rationalize it or dismiss the horror creeping over me. The truth was simple. I was no longer in Oklahoma. I was no longer in my world. I was somewhere else. Somewhere not meant for me. The trees around me seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands. The shadows between them shifted, and every time I glanced away, I felt something moving just out of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. It was like the world was watching me through its fractured, unnatural reflection. My heart beat faster. My chest tightened as the hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. I felt it in my teeth, in my fingertips, like the very air was pressing in on me. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay still in this place, in this dimension. If I stopped, if I hesitated for too long, I might just disappear. I looked up at the sky, trying to make sense of the impossible. But it was no use. The sky was still that black, endless void. There was no sense of time, no hint of light beyond the dark expanse above. It felt like the whole world had been swallowed by the void, and I was left in this strange limbo, trapped in a place that didn't exist, or perhaps existed only because I was here. Was I dreaming? Was this some kind of hallucination? No, it couldn't be. Everything was too real. The ground was too solid beneath me. The air was too thick and heavy to be a mere illusion. The fear I felt, gnawing at my insides, was too real. I was awake. I was here. But where was here? The thought sent a jolt of terror through me. This wasn't a dream. I hadn't crossed into some alternate dimension by accident. I had been pulled here, drawn to this place, by the orbs, by that strange light. I didn't know how or why, but I knew one thing for certain. I didn't belong here. As I took another step, the ground beneath me seemed to groan like it was responding to my every movement. I froze, my body going rigid with fear. The air was charged, and the low hum seemed to shift, changing tone. I turned quickly, convinced something was behind me, but there was nothing except the oppressive darkness of the field. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, like wind, but the words, if they were words, were muffled, distant, incomprehensible. They came from all around me, swirling through the air, brushing against my skin like a cold breath. You shouldn't be here. The voice was sharp, almost cruel. I couldn't tell if it came from the trees, the air, or if it was inside my own head. But it was real. It was here. It was alive. You shouldn't have touched the orb. I spun around, frantic now, looking for any sign of life, any sign of something, someone that could explain what was happening. But the field was empty. The air still hummed, the sky still pressed down, and the trees continued to reach, twisting, bending, like hungry hands stretching toward me. I felt the cold sweat on my skin, and my legs shook beneath me. I had no answers, no explanation, just a growing sense of dread and the certainty that I had somehow crossed into a place where I wasn't welcome. And then I realized, if I had crossed into this place, was there a way back? Or had I become a part of it? Trapped, forever, in this alien world that wasn't supposed to exist? The fear that tightened around my chest threatened to suffocate me, and I felt the panic rise in my throat. I couldn't stay here, couldn't face whatever was lurking in the shadows. I needed to find a way out. But I had no idea where to begin. I could only feel the oppressive pull of the unseen forces around me, the presence in the trees, in the air, in the very pulse of the earth beneath me. They were watching. They were waiting. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I might never leave this place. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me as I stood there in the unnatural glow, the strange hum still vibrating through the air. Every step I took seemed to sink deeper into this world, and each breath I drew felt heavier than the last. The trees, those dark, twisted remnants of the familiar, still loomed over me, their branches stretching into the void above like fingers desperately reaching for something far beyond my comprehension. But then, something shifted in the distance. A flicker, something moving just beyond the trees. I squinted, trying to focus, but the light in the distance was too dim, too distorted. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of my eyes, a result of the disorienting atmosphere around me. But then I saw it again. A shadow, dark and formless, darting between the trees. There was movement, something alive, but it was too far to make out, too indistinct to identify. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched intensified, growing more oppressive by the second. My every instinct screamed at me to turn around and flee, to run as fast as I could to escape whatever lurked in the shadows. But there was something else, a part of me that wanted to know, that wanted to understand. Another shadow passed between the trees, moving too swiftly to be a person. It wasn't human. I could feel that deep in my gut, the unnatural fluidity of the motion, the way the figure slipped in and out of sight, almost purposefully. It wasn't simply walking, it was moving in a way that suggested it was aware of me, that it knew I was watching. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, no more than a soft breeze tugging at my ears, but the more I tried to focus, the clearer they became. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the eerie, unnatural wind that stirred the blackened leaves, but then the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't coming from the trees, not from the wind. No, they were coming from all around me, swirling in the air, filling the space like the very fabric of this world was speaking. Come closer, the whispers beckoned, their voices low, almost soothing in a way, but there was something sinister hidden beneath their calm tone. We are waiting. I swallowed hard, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The voices were not just random noises, they were speaking to me. The words didn't make sense at first, and they blurred together like a tangled mess of half-formed sentences. But then I heard it again, clear as day. Follow the shadows, they will show you the way. The command rang out in my head like a drumbeat, and despite every instinct telling me to run, to get away, I felt my body betray me. My legs moved before I could fully process the thought, drawn toward the shadows moving in the distance. Something in me wanted to resist, but the whispers, the pull of the unknown, were too strong. I couldn't explain why, but I had to follow. Each step I took felt like a surrender. I moved toward the shifting shadows, the shapes moving just beyond my vision, growing clearer with every step. My feet sank deeper into the pulsating ground as the whispers grew louder, their words beginning to make sense, guiding me forward. Closer, closer. I could feel the eyes of the trees on me, and the chill in the air deepened. The shadows ahead seemed to stretch and contort, becoming more distinct. Figures, tall, thin, but with elongated limbs, emerged from the darkness, their forms twisted, their features obscured. They moved in sync, like a dance, their bodies bending and swaying unnaturally, as though they weren't quite right. I felt my breath catch in my throat. They weren't human, and they weren't like anything I had seen before. They were something else, something ancient and unnatural. Their faces were hidden beneath dark hoods, their bodies skeletal and frail, and their movements were jerky, disjointed. They glided effortlessly through the trees, always just out of reach, but their presence was undeniable. The whispers continued, urging me onward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't guiding me, they were hurting me. I wasn't the one making the decision to move forward. Something, or someone, was pushing me toward those shadowy figures. My heart beat faster as I grew closer. A sudden feeling of dread washed over me, and I realized with horrifying clarity that I wasn't in control. I wasn't meant to be here. The shadows knew that. They knew what I was, what I had become. And the whispers didn't sound comforting anymore. They were warnings, commands. A part of me wanted to run, but the fear had paralyzed me. They will not let you leave. The words echoed in my mind like a hammer, and I stumbled back, my legs shaking. But the figures, those twisted, hollow shapes, did not stop moving. They kept coming closer, their elongated arms reaching out as if to pull me into their embrace. The air grew colder still, and the ground beneath me pulsed harder, faster. There was no escape. The whispers, now almost a shrill command, filled my head. Come to us. And for the first time since I had arrived in this strange world, I realized I might never leave. They were waiting for me, and the only way out was to follow. The air felt heavier as I stood there, facing the shadowy figures that loomed at the edge of the field. Their eyes, if they had eyes, seemed to burn with a quiet, unsettling hunger. A cold, unrelenting dread wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing tighter with every second. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my legs trembled beneath me. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't stay still. The whispers surrounded me, crawling into my thoughts, urging me to come closer, to surrender. But I wasn't ready to give in, not yet. The instinct to survive, to find a way out, was still stronger than the pull of whatever lay ahead. I had to escape. I had to get back to the world I knew, the world I had come from, before it was too late. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding. The shadows were still there, watching me, but I refused to let them control me. I could feel their presence, like a weight on my skin, but I forced my legs to move. My feet sank deeper into the ground with each step I took, and the oppressive hum of the world around me grew louder, vibrating through the very air. I began to walk. No, I began to run, my mind desperate to find the boundary, the edge of this place. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking before everything changed. Was it hours? Days? The passage of time in this strange place was distorted. But I knew one thing: the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was sinking into it. My steps faltered as I tried to orient myself. There were no landmarks, no familiar sights to guide me. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees bending and swaying, the sky above black and infinite. No sign of the road. No sign of the truck. No sign of anything that had been familiar to me. Only the warped and distorted landscape that mocked my very existence. I stopped, breathless, my hands clutching my sides. How had I gotten so far from where I started? Where had the path gone? The feeling of being lost had become overwhelming. I had turned around, gone in the opposite direction, thinking I could somehow retrace my steps. But everything here felt wrong, alien. No matter how many times I tried to walk back, the path ahead only led me deeper into the unknown. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. The more I moved, the further I seemed to be from the original world. Every step I took, every direction I turned, only seemed to deepen my confusion. I couldn't find the way back. I wasn't going back at all. This place, this world, it didn't work the way I understood. There were no rules here. No limits. I was trapped in an endless loop, a maze with no exit. I spun in place, desperately scanning the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that could break the cycle. But the field stretched on forever, the trees closing in around me like a tightening fist. The shadows in the distance were no longer just figures, they were shapes, moving, shifting, blending into the very fabric of the world. They were closing in. A faint chill crawled up my spine. I had no sense of time, no sense of direction. It felt like the land itself was alive, shifting with every step I took, warping around me, guiding me in the wrong direction. No matter how hard I tried to turn back, no matter how fast I ran, I always ended up deeper in the same endless stretch of twisted trees and pulsating ground. The whispers still echoed in my ears, but now they had become a constant murmur, indistinguishable, like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. Follow us. Come closer. We will show you the way. It was a promise, a command, a lure, and I couldn't escape it. I took another step, my legs shaking beneath me, the cold wind whipping through the air like a sharp, biting knife. The field around me was a sickening blur, a nightmare made real. And with every step, the truth settled deeper in my mind. There was no way back. I couldn't escape. I had crossed into this place, and now I was a part of it. Trapped in a world that didn't belong to me, where time had no meaning, where the boundaries of reality had shattered, and I was left to wander, lost. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, and I stumbled forward, unable to maintain my balance. I caught myself, but it didn't matter. I was sinking deeper, further into the endless expanse of the field, further away from the world I had known. The air seemed to stretch, to distort, the very space around me warping as if I were falling through some unseen abyss. A soft whisper, almost playful, brushed against my ear. "You can't run from us. You belong here now." I froze. The voice was clear now, and the words felt like chains wrapping around my soul. I realized, with a horrible certainty, that there was no escape. No return. The more I tried to move, the more the world shifted, and the deeper I fell into its grasp. I was lost. I had been lost the moment I touched the orb. And now, I was never going back. The field stretched on endlessly before me, the warped trees and pulsating ground a constant reminder that I was trapped in a place I couldn't understand. My footsteps were muffled by the thick, unnatural air, and with every movement, it felt like the world itself was closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here, not truly. The shadows, the whispers, the flickering figures, they were always in the periphery of my vision, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. I had become so consumed with trying to find a way out that I hadn't noticed the figures ahead until I was nearly upon them. They stood frozen in the middle of the field, their backs rigid, as if they had been turned to stone. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart leaping into my throat as I stared at them. There were 5 of them, standing motionless under the dim light of the distorted sky. At first, I thought they were just more of the twisted shapes of the field, shadows blending into the landscape. But as I got closer, the horrifying reality of their presence struck me like a physical blow. They were people, real people. Or at least, they had been. Their faces were locked in expressions of pure terror, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouths frozen in screams that would never escape. I could feel the tension in the air, the thick weight of their fear still clinging to the space around them. Their bodies were unnaturally still, but their posture, rigid, unmoving, was not the way someone would stand willingly. It was as if they were caught in time, their souls trapped in a moment of terror they could never escape. I stepped closer, my feet hesitant, every nerve on high alert. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to flee, but something anchored me to the spot. Was I really seeing this? Were these people trapped here too? What had happened to them? I dared not touch them, fearing that even the slightest contact would pull me deeper into whatever fate they had suffered. There was a man in the front, his eyes wide and glassy, his lips parted as if he had been screaming for eternity. I couldn't see his features clearly. They were distorted, almost unreal in the way the light from the orbs cast strange shadows on his face. His body was frozen in place, yet his eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, followed me as I moved. It was as if he could see me, but he couldn't speak, couldn't move. I moved to the next person, a woman who stood just a few feet away, her hands raised in front of her as if she had been trying to protect herself. Her fingers were splayed, caught in an eternal, desperate gesture. Her face was contorted with fear, her skin pale, and her body stiff with the same unnatural stillness. I could feel her panic like a wave crashing against me, even though she couldn't move. There were no words, no sounds from them, just the endless whispering in the air, urging me forward. The figures, though motionless, seemed to exude a kind of presence. I could feel their fear seeping into me, a cold, paralyzing sensation that threatened to freeze my own body in place. The longer I stood among them, the more I realized I was staring at people who had been trapped here for who knew how long. They were lost, just like me. My mind reeled with questions. What happened to them? How had they ended up here? How had they been caught in this hellish place where time seemed irrelevant, where fear could stop your body in its tracks? The woman's eyes locked on me, and though she couldn't speak, I could almost hear the silent plea in her gaze. Help us, save us. But there was no way to help. No way to save them. I wasn't even sure I could save myself. I stepped back, a surge of panic rising in my chest. I could feel the weight of their presence, their terror pressing down on me, but I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out of this nightmare, even if it meant leaving them behind. But just as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. Another figure, darker, more shadowed than the rest, appeared, flickering in and out of view. It was a man, standing off to the side, but his face was different. His expression wasn't frozen in terror, it was serene, almost knowing. He watched me from afar, his eyes dark and empty, and something about his gaze sent a chill through me, colder than anything I had felt so far. I didn't dare approach him. There was something wrong with him. Something wrong with the way he stood there, watching, waiting. I could feel the weight of his presence as if he was watching me even though I was too far away to see him clearly. My heart beat faster, and I quickly turned back to the figures in front of me. I could still hear the whispers, louder now, urging me to move, to follow the shadows, to join the ranks of those who had been lost before me. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while there were still questions, still pieces of this nightmare left to unravel. I glanced back at the frozen figures, each one trapped in their own moment of terror. They were victims of the orbs, of this place, of whatever dark force ruled here. And now, I feared, I was becoming one of them. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for any of us. I turned and began walking, my feet dragging through the field, the whispers in my ears growing louder, the fear rising in my chest. But no matter how far I walked, the figures, those lost souls, stayed with me, their frozen faces haunting me with every step. I stood there for a long time, staring at the motionless figures, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, anything that could justify this nightmare. The air was thick with a strange stillness, the usual hum of the world now replaced by a suffocating silence. Despite my terror, I felt an overwhelming need to reach out, to speak to them. To understand what had happened, to know if they were truly lost, if they could somehow be saved. Hello? I called, my voice trembling in the oppressive air. It felt wrong to speak, like the sound might shatter the fragile moment of stillness around me, but I couldn't stop myself. There was no response. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Can you hear me? I repeated, louder this time, my voice echoing strangely across the field. But still, there was nothing. No movement. No flicker of recognition. I felt a cold knot of dread settle deeper in my chest. Their eyes were open, wide and fixed, locked in an eternal stare. But they didn't blink. They didn't shift. It was as though they were frozen, their bodies trapped in an agonizing moment of fear they could never escape. Their faces were locked in expressions that made my stomach turn, caught forever in a state of terror. I reached out, my hand shaking, but stopped just short of touching the woman who had been closest to me. What if I touched her, and she shattered into dust? What if she fell apart the way everything else in this twisted place seemed to do? The thought made my skin crawl. "Please," I whispered, more to myself than to them. "What happened to you? How did you get here?" There was no answer. I moved closer, carefully, afraid to touch them but unable to stop myself from looking. The man with the wide, unblinking eyes still seemed to be staring directly at me, and I felt the weight of his gaze on me. It was as though he was watching from a distance, trapped behind some invisible barrier, unable to move. His mouth was open in that eternal scream, but it never broke the silence. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. Why aren't they responding? It was as if they couldn't hear me, or worse, as if they didn't want to hear me. No matter how close I got, no matter how many times I called out, they stayed perfectly still, their frozen faces an unspoken testament to their fate. "Please," I repeated, my voice a whisper now. "What happened to you? How do I get out of here?" Nothing. A deep, unsettling silence surrounded me, as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, hoping that they would somehow break free of the spell that held them, that they would move, respond, even just blink. But they didn't. Their faces remained locked in fear, their bodies stiff and unyielding. They were caught in time. A time that never moved forward, a time that had no end. I turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get away from these frozen figures, these souls trapped in a purgatory I couldn't understand. But the moment I turned, I could feel their presence in the corner of my mind, their eyes still watching me, their silent screams echoing in the emptiness of my thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder, had I already become one of them? Was I already trapped in the same timeless moment, doomed to stand frozen in place forever, my body caught in some endless loop of terror and despair? I shook the thought away, but it clung to me, lingering like a shadow I couldn't escape. The longer I stood in this place, the more I began to question my own reality. Had the orbs already started their work on me, freezing me in this cursed dimension where time had no meaning? The thought made my chest tighten with fear, and I turned my back to the frozen figures once more. If they couldn't help me, if they couldn't tell me how to escape, then I had no choice but to keep moving forward. But the weight of their silence followed me, like a cold shadow, pressing down on my every step. And I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I walked, no matter how much time passed, I would never truly leave them behind. Panic started to rise in my chest, clawing at my throat as I looked around the endless, twisted field. I had to leave. I have to leave. The figures, those frozen, tortured souls, stayed in my peripheral vision, their silent faces haunting me, their fear bleeding into my own thoughts. But I couldn't just stand there, staring at them. I had to find an exit, a way to escape this nightmare. I turned, my eyes frantic, searching for anything that could give me some direction, some hint of how to get out of this place. I was dizzy with the weight of it all. The trees, their twisted forms casting elongated shadows, the pulsing ground beneath me, it all felt wrong. The whispers that had been ever present were louder now, more insistent, tugging at my mind like invisible hands trying to pull me into the darkness. I stumbled backward, desperate, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing. Think. There's got to be a way out of here. But every path I took only seemed to lead me deeper into the heart of the field, further away from anything resembling reality. I turned to my left, my gaze desperate, hoping to see something, anything, that would bring me closer to safety. But all I saw were more figures, more frozen bodies, each one locked in its eternal moment of fear. I could hear their silent screams in my head, echoing with every step I took. I forced myself to turn away, my legs trembling beneath me as I moved quickly in the opposite direction. I couldn't let them get to me. I couldn't let myself become like them, trapped in this place, forever unable to move, to speak, to break free. I sprinted, the ground soft beneath my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices I couldn't understand, urging me on. The farther I ran, the more figures I saw. More faces, more bodies frozen in place, their eyes fixed on me as if they knew exactly what was happening. I could feel their gaze burning into me, their silence deafening in its intensity. I was running in circles. The realization hit me like a physical blow. No matter which direction I took, I ended up at the same spot. The same figures. The same faces. The same frozen terror. It didn't matter how many times I turned, how fast I moved, every path led back to them. To the horror. My legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was pushing against me, trying to hold me in place. I stopped for a moment, gasping for air, my chest tight with panic. I had no idea where I was anymore. I had no sense of direction. The world had folded in on itself, and all that existed now was the field, the orbs, and the people who had been lost long before me. I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure, the one with the empty, knowing gaze, following me. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of twisted trees and the glowing orbs hovering like distant stars. I can't breathe. The thought consumed me as my lungs struggled to draw air into my body. I felt suffocated, trapped in a world that made no sense. The figures were closing in on me, their faces now mere inches from mine, as if they were surrounding me, forcing me into their silent, eternal prison. I turned again, the darkness in the air swallowing me whole, and took off in a different direction, this time with a frantic, mindless determination. But it didn't matter. It never did. More figures. More frozen bodies. The fear was thick in the air, suffocating me, drowning me. I could almost feel the cold tendrils of their dread wrapping around my throat, tightening with every breath. Their faces were everywhere now, their eyes haunting me. Help us. I could almost hear them begging, though their mouths never moved. I stumbled to a halt, feeling the world tilt beneath me. I collapsed to my knees, my hands trembling, trying to steady myself. The orbs above flickered, their light casting eerie shadows across the field. But nothing made sense anymore. My thoughts were tangled, my mind a maze of panic and confusion. What is this place? I thought desperately. Why can't I leave? The world felt like it was closing in around me, suffocating, pressing on all sides. The whispers had grown louder, and now they sounded almost like voices, sharp, fragmented, full of warnings I couldn't comprehend. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing to stop them. With a final, desperate scream, I tried to push myself back onto my feet. But my body refused to cooperate. The fear, my own, their own, had seeped into my bones, frozen me in place. I was no longer sure if I was moving at all, or if I had ever been. The figures remained. Frozen. Silent. Trapped. And no matter how far I ran, how many times I turned, it was clear. I was just one more figure to join them. One more frozen body in the field of the vanishing. There was no escape. Only endless, haunting silence. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled forward, my mind barely able to keep up with the panic flooding my body. The whispers were louder now, like 1,000 voices in my ears, each one more insistent than the last. The figures around me blurred as I ran, the twisted trees and pulsing ground dissolving into a nightmarish blur of shapes and shadows. I have to get out of here. I can't stay here. I can't be like them. The thought echoed in my mind, but it was becoming harder and harder to think. Fear was consuming me, clouding everything else. I didn't even know where I was going anymore, just running as if the very act of moving would somehow make it stop. The cold air stung my skin, the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a physical force. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see them, those faceless, frozen figures, chasing me, closing in with every step. But there was nothing. They were gone. Or maybe I had just outrun them. I can't stop. I can't stop. I pushed myself faster, my breath ragged and erratic. My legs burned, my mind a haze of panic. But it didn't matter. It was all pointless. The field stretched endlessly in front of me, the same twisted trees, the same glowing orbs flickering in the distance, beckoning me closer. There was no escape. No way out. And then, in the midst of the panic, my foot caught on something. For a split second, my body lurched forward, and the ground beneath me seemed to give way. My arms flailed in a desperate attempt to steady myself, but it was too late. My foot twisted, and I lost my balance entirely, crashing forward. Time slowed as I fell, my mind a blur of frantic thoughts and terror. I reached out instinctively, trying to grab onto something, anything, but the world was slipping from my grasp. And then, I felt the air shift beneath me, a strange, unnatural pull, like gravity had suddenly changed its direction. What is that? The thought barely had time to form before I was tumbling, spiraling toward it. My feet were no longer touching the ground, and I was being drawn forward with a force I couldn't understand. I glanced down, my stomach twisting in horror. Below me, the ground had split open, revealing a dark, swirling pit of light, a vortex of shifting colors, like liquid fire, spinning rapidly in the center of the field. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The light pulsed and shimmered, its energy pulling me in with terrifying force. It wasn't just light, it was something else, something alive. I gasped, my heart stopping in my chest. No. No, no, no. I kicked my legs frantically, trying to push myself away from the swirling light, but it was impossible. The pull was too strong, too overwhelming. I was falling toward it, the air around me thick and heavy. I could feel the edges of my vision starting to blur, my body growing weaker with every passing second. The pit was alive, hungry, and I was nothing but prey. I can't go in there. The thought screamed in my mind. I can't. But no matter how hard I fought, no matter how desperately I clawed at the air, it was too late. I felt my body surrender to the pull. In the next instant, I was swallowed whole. The world dissolved into a cascade of light and shadow as the vortex enveloped me, pulling me deeper into its core. I couldn't tell where my body ended and the light began. My entire being felt as though it was being torn apart, stretched and twisted in every direction. There was no up, no down, no left or right, just endless spiraling energy that seemed to erase all sense of time, of reality. And then, in an instant, everything went dark. The light faded, leaving only an oppressive, choking darkness. I gasped, trying to take in a breath, but the air felt thick, like I was breathing underwater. Where am I? The question echoed in my mind, but it didn't make any sense. There was no answer. I was completely alone. And then the whispers started again. This time, they weren't distant or fragmented. They were close, too close. They echoed in my ears, circling around me like invisible hands. I could feel them pressing against my mind, trying to force their way in, drowning me in their words. "You're here now. Forever." The voice was sharp, clear, and cold. I gasped, the sound of my own breath loud in the suffocating silence. No. The thought was a desperate plea. I can't stay here. I can't be one of them. But the whispers didn't stop. And the darkness never let go. The whispers were suffocating me, clawing at my thoughts, their cold words tearing through the fog of panic in my mind. "Forever. You're trapped." The voices seemed to come from every direction, surrounding me, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I could feel them in my chest, in my bones, in the very air I breathed. My heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, until it became impossible to tell whether the sound was mine or something else. My vision flickered, the shadows of the dark world swirling around me, growing thicker, suffocating. The overwhelming pull of the void seemed to press in from all sides, tightening, squeezing. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was frozen, trapped in place, caught between the reality I knew and the nightmare that had swallowed me whole. This can't be real. The thought barely formed in my mind before it was drowned out by the deafening hum that filled the air. My body trembled as I fought against the suffocating darkness, my limbs useless, like they were made of lead. I need to wake up. I need to get out. I can't stay here. But the darkness didn't answer. The voices didn't stop. They just continued, swirling around me, relentless. And then, without warning, the air shifted again. The energy, the oppressive hum, grew stronger, vibrating through my chest, through my skull, until it felt as though the very air was alive and angry. I felt the pull of something deep within the void, something vast and powerful, reaching for me, trying to drag me further into the depths. No. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry, and the words wouldn't form. My vision was swimming, my thoughts spinning out of control. It was as if the world itself was twisting into something unrecognizable. The light, the dark, the whispers, the weight, all of it was crushing me. Then, without any warning, a sudden flash of light exploded before my eyes. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A blinding, searing flash that flooded my senses, so intense I could feel it in my very soul. It pierced through the suffocating darkness, burning, overwhelming, until I felt like my body was being ripped apart. My skin burned, my mind screamed, but I could do nothing. The light filled every inch of me, drowning out every thought, every fear, until it felt like there was nothing left but the light itself. I felt my body jerk, my muscles seizing in response to the energy, but it was all too much. The flash became all-consuming, and in the split second before everything went white, I felt my consciousness snap, like a thread breaking. And then, darkness. Complete, utter darkness. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating, but at the same time, it was a release. No light. No voices. No endless, twisted field. Just the absence of everything. But even in the emptiness, I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't over. Not yet. I woke with a start, my body jerking upright as if pulled by some invisible force. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, the sensation so real it was almost unbearable. I blinked rapidly, my vision blurry at first, as though I had just emerged from a dream or perhaps something worse. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The ground beneath me was solid, familiar, but still wrong. The grass was the same as before, soft and damp beneath my palms, the same familiar rustling of leaves in the evening wind. The distant hills were silhouetted against the fading light, the same world I had known. But everything was off. The air was thick in a way I couldn't explain, the scent of earth and grass tinged with something faintly metallic, like the remnants of a storm. The world seemed still in a way that wasn't natural, too quiet, too heavy. The hum that had filled the strange version of the field was gone, but in its absence, there was a new weight to the atmosphere. It pressed down on me, as though something had shifted while I had been lost in the void. This is it, I thought, my pulse quickening. I'm back. I made it out. I looked around, hoping to find some sign that I was truly back in the world I knew. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. It should have been comforting, peaceful, even, but it only made the feeling of unease grow stronger. The sky, once a gentle orange, was now a pale gray, as though a layer of fog had settled just beneath the surface of the atmosphere, dulling the colors. There were no orbs, no glowing lights, no otherworldly hum. The field was empty. But something was wrong. I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching as though I had been lying there for hours or days. I took a cautious step forward, and then another. The ground beneath my boots felt strangely unstable, as if it were shifting with each step. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, but there was an unnatural stillness to the air, like the world was holding its breath. The faintest rustle echoed from somewhere in the distance, just far enough away to make me question whether it had been real. Did I imagine it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to second-guess myself. Not after everything I had been through. I walked further into the field, the landscape stretching out before me, familiar yet foreign. The trees looked the same, tall, old, and gnarled, but their shapes seemed sharper, more defined, as if they were somehow more present in this world than they had ever been before. The horizon, once so distant and unreachable, felt closer now, as though the distance had somehow contracted. As I moved, the air grew heavier. The feeling of being watched crept up my spine, a sensation I couldn't shake. I paused, scanning the field, but there was nothing there. No figures. No shadows lurking behind the trees. Yet the stillness, the unnatural stillness, was more oppressive than I had ever felt. It was as though the world was waiting, holding its breath, for something to happen. I felt a tremor deep in my chest, the faintest flutter of panic rising in the pit of my stomach. What if I never truly left? What if it followed me? I had no answers, only the sense that something had changed in me and in this place. A chill ran through me, colder than the evening air, and I turned quickly, expecting to see something. Anything. But there was only the field. Empty. Silent. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A single orb, glowing faintly, hovering just above the ground like it had never left. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. It was small, so small compared to the ones I had seen before, but it was unmistakably the same. The pull was instant, that same irresistible urge to move toward it, to reach out and touch it. My limbs felt stiff, as if fighting against the impulse, but it was too strong. Too familiar. I took a step toward it, then another, and the world around me seemed to bend with each movement. The field stretched and warped in ways I couldn't explain, the trees shifting ever so slightly in my peripheral vision. I could hear the hum again, faint at first, but growing louder as I drew closer. And as I reached out toward the orb, the world seemed to hold its breath. Was this a second chance? Or was it the end? I couldn't tell anymore. I snapped out of my trance, my hand hovering just inches from the orb, and stepped back. The sudden awareness of my surroundings hit me like a punch to the gut. The field, once familiar, now felt wrong, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin and was about to snap. My heart raced, and I could feel the pulse of fear in my veins as I turned away from the orb and began walking back toward my truck. I need to get out of here. I need to leave before it's too late. The truck, my only connection to safety, to reality, was just a few hundred yards away. But with each step, the distance seemed to stretch further, the field around me never ending. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass, and the air grew thicker, more oppressive. I quickened my pace, the sound of my boots crunching against the earth the only noise in the overwhelming silence. But then, a strange sensation crawled over me, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, an invisible presence, watching, waiting. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it, whispers. Soft at first, like distant voices carried by the breeze, just barely audible. But as I stood frozen in place, the whispers grew louder. "You're not alone." The words were barely more than a breath, just a flicker at the edge of my hearing. But I knew they were there. I could feel the weight of them pressing against my mind, brushing up against my thoughts, like something outside of me was trying to get in. "It's not over." I spun around, scanning the field, my pulse pounding in my ears. But there was nothing, no figure, no shape, just the endless waves of tall grass swaying in the wind. The landscape, though familiar, felt alien, like a place I had never truly been before. The whispers didn't stop. They continued, growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices calling out from the darkness. "Come back. You can't escape." I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. The air around me was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was as if the field itself was alive, the very soil beneath my feet pulsing with some unnatural energy. I turned toward my truck again, desperation creeping into my movements. I needed to get out of there, to put miles between myself and whatever this place was becoming. But before I could take another step, the ground shifted beneath me, subtle at first, just a slight tremor, like the earth was breathing. "You belong here now." The whisper was so close, so clear, I could feel it in my chest. I whipped around, my eyes darting across the field, but again, I saw nothing. Only the trees, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and the long stretches of grass, bending in ways that defied the breeze. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My legs felt like lead, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but something held me in place. Something was keeping me here, in this suffocating silence, in this strange, altered reality where the rules didn't seem to apply. What is this place? What is it that's trying to keep me here? The whispers faded for a moment, and the world went still. The wind died down, and the ground felt solid again, like the tension had released for just a second. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it deep inside, like a warning thrumming beneath my skin. I turned back toward the truck, my legs shaking as I forced myself to take another step. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had not. And as I walked, a cold chill wrapped itself around me. The presence was still there. And in the distance, faintly, I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. Not a person, not a figure, but something far worse. My legs carried me forward, but my mind felt distant, as though I were walking through a dream. I barely noticed the uneven terrain beneath my boots or the distant murmur of the wind. The weight in my chest pressed harder, making it harder to breathe. I had to get to the truck. I had to leave before the field swallowed me whole again. But something gnawed at me, an unease that had nothing to do with the whispers or the strange presence. I couldn't remember how I got back. The thought struck me suddenly, like a cold gust of wind. My steps faltered, and I looked down at the ground, searching for something, anything, that could anchor me in the reality I thought I had returned to. I hadn't seen the orb when I woke, yet here I was, walking toward my truck like it was just another evening in rural Oklahoma. How much time had passed? Was it minutes? Hours? Days? I couldn't recall a single moment between the flash of light and now. I couldn't remember how I had made it back here, to this field. Had I even left? I stopped, my body trembling with the weight of the question. My head spun, the pieces of my memories scattering like dust in the wind. I had seen things, horrible, twisted things. Hadn't I? The other world, the shadowy figures, the whispers. My hand shot to my forehead, my fingers pressing against my skin as though trying to hold my thoughts together. But nothing came to me. Just the same endless pull of the field. The same oppressive silence that seemed to close in around me. How could I have forgotten? How could I not remember the journey back? I forced myself to take a step forward, my mind desperate to latch onto something, anything that made sense. The truck was still ahead, just a few yards away, but it felt so distant now. It felt wrong. A sharp, stinging pain suddenly shot through my chest, and I gasped, clutching at my shirt. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, but it was more than just a physical sensation. It was as though I were being torn in two, my body fighting to remember, but my mind refusing. I blinked, my gaze unfocused. What happened to me? Had I been gone for days? Hours? How had I gotten here? It didn't add up. The world around me was too quiet, too still. The soft rustling of grass in the wind felt like it belonged to a different time, a time before I had ever set foot in the field. There was something familiar about it, yet strange. Had I been here before? I could hear my breath now, heavy and ragged, breaking through the eerie silence. My throat was dry. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the questions just kept swirling in my mind, spinning faster with each passing second. I looked back over my shoulder, my eyes searching the horizon as if expecting to find some sign, some clue. But all I saw were the same trees, the same field. There was no trace of the other world, no sign of the orbs. But I knew that I had been there. I had touched the orb. I had crossed over. And yet, I couldn't remember how I had come back. I rubbed my eyes, as though trying to wake up from a dream. But the sensation, the confusion, the dizziness remained. The field, the truck, the trees, all of it felt like a mask over something darker, something I couldn't quite grasp. The question hung in the air like an unsolvable riddle. How much time had passed? I glanced back at the truck. I should have kept walking, should have reached it already, but something was holding me back. Something was stopping me from crossing that final stretch. I had to understand what had happened. I had to know what had become of me, of the place I had just left behind, of the things that had followed me here. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind seemed to spiral. The seconds stretched into minutes, into hours, until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The whispering wind picked up again, a faint voice threading through the air. You can't remember. I froze, the words chilling me to the core. They were the same words I had heard before, in the other world, but now they felt different, as though they were meant for me, not for the shadows that had haunted me. You belong here, too. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, and this time, I didn't fight it. The field wasn't done with me. It wasn't finished. And neither was I. The whispers didn't fade. Instead, they intensified, swirling around me, tugging at my thoughts like invisible threads. You can't escape. You can't remember. You belong here. I clutched my head, feeling the air closing around me, pressing down on my skull. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and my vision blurred at the edges as the whispers continued to grow louder, more insistent. They weren't just voices in the wind anymore. They were inside my head, crawling beneath my skin, tightening their grip on my mind. Was it real? The question echoed through my mind, repeating over and over like a mantra. Had any of it ever really happened? The orbs, the other world, the shadowy figures, they seemed so real, so vivid, and yet, maybe it was all just a dream. Maybe it was nothing more than a nightmare I had woken up from. But how could I explain the feeling, the sensation of being trapped, of being watched? How could I explain the cold that had gripped my soul in that other place, the pull of the orb that had felt so real, the overwhelming sense of dread that had surrounded me like a suffocating fog? The whispers twisted, turning into fragments of sentences that made no sense, blending together like a nightmare that refused to wake. You're not who you think you are. You'll never be free. I stumbled backward, my hands flying up to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me now, vibrating through my skull, making my thoughts feel like they were coming apart. I didn't know if I was still in the field, if I was still in the same reality, or if I had slipped into something else entirely. The world around me warped, the trees bending at impossible angles, the grass rippling like waves on an ocean. This isn't real. This can't be real. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My chest tightened, and my body felt heavier with each passing second, like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't escape. Was this what it was? Was I losing my mind? Was this all just a fevered hallucination brought on by exhaustion? The air turned cold again, the temperature dropping like the world itself had exhaled a breath. I shivered, the chill seeping into my bones, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly warm. Was this my reality now? I felt my knees begin to tremble, the ground beneath me shifting again as though it were alive, trying to pull me into its grasp. My hand shot out to steady myself, but it was no use. Everything felt like it was collapsing in on itself, like I was being swallowed by something I couldn't even begin to understand. Maybe I'm just losing it. I shook my head, trying to focus. But every time I thought I had a grip on what was happening, the edges of my mind would splinter again, sending me spiraling. The whispers twisted around me, so close now that I could almost feel them brushing against my skin. You can't escape. There's no way out. I pressed my hands to my ears harder, but nothing helped. The voices, no, the presence, was inside me now, wrapping itself around my thoughts, growing louder, more insistent. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. Was it real? I didn't know anymore. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and I was standing in the middle of it, caught between two worlds. The truck was just ahead, wasn't it? It had to be. But every time I looked, it felt farther away, slipping further from my reach, like the field was shifting to keep me from leaving. What if this was just my mind playing tricks on me? What if none of it had happened? But deep down, a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me it had happened. I could still feel the warmth of the orb, still hear the whispers that had followed me, still sense the presence watching me from the shadows. The air was too thick, too heavy for it to be a mere dream. You are here now. The words shot through my mind like a jolt of electricity. I snapped my head around, but there was nothing. Only the trees, the endless stretch of grass, and the emptiness that pressed in on me. My thoughts were a jumble now, swirling together in a mess of confusion and fear. I couldn't trust my own mind. What if I was losing myself? What if this was how it ended? The whispers faded, but the presence, the weight of it, remained. Every step I took forward felt like a step deeper into something I couldn't escape. Was it real? I still didn't have an answer. But as the world around me seemed to twist and warp, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer sure of anything at all. In the distance, faint against the darkening sky, I saw it. One last orb. It flickered weakly at first, as though hesitant, but the moment I laid eyes on it, the pull was immediate and undeniable. There it was, hanging in the air like a dying star, barely illuminating the darkened field with its soft, erratic glow. My heart skipped, a strange mixture of dread and curiosity washing over me. I had just barely come to terms with the horrors I had experienced, the whispers, the figures, the twisting reality of the other world. Yet, here it was again, an orb, beckoning me forward, like a magnet drawing me closer. Don't go! The voice in my head screamed at me, the warning echoing in my mind, but it was drowned out by the voice that called me from the distance. A quiet, persistent hum that felt both terrifying and hypnotic. I could feel the pressure in my chest, the weight of my breath as my legs moved forward despite every instinct telling me to stop. I had to see it. I had to know what it was. The world around me seemed to blur the closer I got, like a shifting fog. The once familiar trees were now distant, unrecognizable shapes in the dark. The wind that had been whispering my name earlier now felt like a living thing, brushing against my skin, coaxing me forward. The orb flickered again, its light faint and fragile, as though it were on the verge of fading entirely. But the closer I got, the stronger the pull became. It felt like something more than a simple object, something alive, waiting for me. I took another step, then another, each one carrying me closer. The ground beneath me felt different now, uneven, like I was walking on shifting sand. But my gaze never left the orb, now growing brighter as I neared it, despite its flickering light. I stopped for a moment, hesitation seizing me. I knew what I had already seen, what I had already experienced. I knew the cost of getting too close to the unknown. What if it happens again? The thought echoed through my mind. What if I lost myself again, spiraling into that dark, twisted version of the world I had barely escaped? But the orb called to me, louder now, its glow beckoning like a whisper only I could hear. Just one more time, the voice inside me urged, just one more touch. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering in the air as if unsure whether I should reach out. It was almost as if the orb could sense my hesitation. The flickering grew more erratic, almost frantic. Then, Without warning, it pulsed once, twice, and in that moment, I knew it was no longer waiting. It wanted me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong. My body moved as though it had a mind of its own, each step carrying me closer to the orb. It had control over me, now, just like it had in the other world. I reached out, my hand trembling as I got closer, the light growing more intense. And then, I touched it. At first, there was nothing. The orb was warm, almost comforting against my skin, like the soft heat of the sun just before it sets. But then, a shock ran through me, unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't a jolt of electricity, but something more profound, something deeper. A sensation that dug into the marrow of my bones, that chilled me from the inside out. I gasped, stumbling backward, but the orb pulled me forward again. My body couldn't resist. It was as if an invisible force was forcing me into it. The world around me dissolved into a blur of colors, blues, reds, purples, flashing by in rapid succession. No! I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The orb glowed brighter, blinding me with its light. And just before everything around me disappeared, I caught one final glimpse of the field, of the truck, the trees, the fading stars above. Then, I was gone. I stood there, staring at the flickering orb, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. The pull was undeniable, stronger now than ever before. But this time, there was no curiosity, no confusion. I knew what it was. I knew what it represented. It was death. It was an ending, a conclusion that I hadn't been able to grasp until now. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn away, but my feet felt as if they were rooted to the spot. The light pulsed in front of me, erratic, unpredictable, yet mesmerizing, like a trap designed to ensnare whoever dared come too close. The whispers were there again, softer now, but still there. You can't leave. You can't escape. They slipped into my thoughts like an old, familiar tune, the words no longer frightening but oppressive, suffocating. They were not just voices. They were memories, feelings, fragments of everything I had experienced. I had seen the figures, the frozen people, their faces locked in expressions of terror. I had felt the weight of the other world pressing against me, pulling at my soul, as if it were made of nothing but fear and isolation. I had known, deep down, that whatever this was, whatever the orbs were, it wasn't a place you could return from. It was a one-way door, a portal to something darker, something worse. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath. This wasn't real, not in the way I wanted to believe. The world around me still looked familiar, rural Oklahoma, the field where I had first encountered the lights, the truck still parked at the edge. But there was a subtle shift in the air. It was thinner, more hollow, as if the world itself had become fragile, like it could break apart at any moment. Nothing felt right anymore. I felt a coldness seep into my bones, and it wasn't from the evening air. It was the cold of realization. The cold of knowing that the world I had left behind, my life, my sense of self, was lost forever. It didn't matter if I returned to the field or if I fled to the ends of the earth. There was no escape. The orb flickered once more, brighter this time, and I knew that it was calling me again, urging me to take that final step, to let go of the world I knew, to vanish into the unknown. My body was trembling, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming certainty that this was the moment when everything would change. This was the end. I swallowed hard, trying to force my legs to move, to run, to turn away. but my feet were still planted firmly on the ground. No matter how much I wanted to escape, no matter how loudly my mind screamed for me to turn back, I was trapped. The orb, the field, the whispers, they were a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my existence. A cold realization washed over me. I wasn't supposed to escape. The orb wasn't just an object, it was the truth, unfathomable, terrifying, and final. Those who had been taken had belonged there, as if they had always been meant to be a part of that place, and now I was no different. My reality had fractured long ago, and now I was left with nothing but fragments of memories and a creeping sense of helplessness. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a dream. It was real. I reached out, my hand trembling, the light from the orb enveloping me. A surge of warmth shot through me, then quickly turned to an all-encompassing cold that froze my soul. The air around me vibrated with a deep hum, as though the entire universe were resonating with my very being. This is where I belong, I thought, and it felt true. I wasn't fighting anymore. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't go back from. I stepped forward, and the world around me shattered. The last thing I felt was the pull of the orb, dragging me into the darkness, into the void that had been waiting for me all along. The moment my fingers brushed the surface of the orb, everything around me ceased to exist. It was as though time itself unraveled, pulling me into a vortex of light and sound, a cacophony that twisted and contorted, breaking all sense of order. The orb's glow intensified, surrounding me like a cage of pure energy. For a heartbeat, I was weightless, suspended between realities, and then everything shifted. The ground beneath me disappeared, the sky fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces, and I was plunged into the other world again. The familiar, suffocating darkness enveloped me, the air thick with that low, oppressive hum. I gasped for breath, but there was no air here, not as I knew it. My lungs burned, my body felt heavier, like gravity had suddenly become cruel, pressing down on me with an unbearable force. I stumbled, disoriented, my legs giving way as I collapsed onto the ground. But it wasn't the ground I knew. It was soft and uneven, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, as if the earth itself were alive, breathing beneath me. I blinked, trying to adjust to the dim, distorted landscape. The field was gone. The sky was no longer the deep twilight blue of Oklahoma. Here, it was an inky black, dotted with flickering stars that seemed too far away, too distant to offer any comfort. The trees were nothing like those I had left behind. They were twisted, gnarled shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, stretching toward me with an eerie intent. I could feel them watching me. They were always watching. The hum was louder now, vibrating through my bones, crawling under my skin. I pulled myself to my feet, my mind racing, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. How could this be real? It was like I had never left. The orb had brought me back here, pulled me into this place again, where nothing made sense and everything felt wrong. But it wasn't just the environment that had changed, it was me. There was something different in the air. The whispers had grown stronger, and this time they were clearer. They weren't just random murmurs carried on the wind, they were voices that called my name, that beckoned me forward. You cannot escape. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't remember where I had heard it before. It was like it had always been there, waiting for me to understand. You never left. You never will. I took a tentative step forward, my heart racing as I glanced around. The figures, those shadowy forms I had seen before, moved in the distance, lingering just outside my field of vision. They were not still anymore. They were closer, much closer, their dark shapes shifting with a fluidity that defied reason. And their eyes, those eyes, I could feel them burning into me, studying me, as if they were waiting for something. I didn't want to move. My legs felt like they were locked in place, but the pull of the orb, the pull of this world, was stronger than any fear I felt. I knew I couldn't run. There was no escape from this place. Not anymore. I could feel it in the very core of my being. This world was my prison, and I had been its prisoner all along. As I stood there, frozen by the realization, the ground beneath me shuddered. The hum intensified, vibrating through every fiber of my body, and I heard it, clearer now, unmistakable. "They're coming for you." The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was all around me. The figures in the distance were moving toward me, closing in with a steady, unyielding pace. There was no running, no hiding, no way to fight it. I turned back toward the orb, still floating in the distance, its glow dimmer now, but still there, still waiting for me. And I knew that if I walked toward it again, I would be taken once more. This place would become my reality, my eternity. But in that moment, something deep inside me shattered. A part of me fought back, no more. I had already succumbed once, and now, standing on the precipice of being consumed entirely, I wanted to resist. I wanted to break free. I could hear the footsteps now, the figures drawing nearer with each passing second. They weren't human. They were something worse. But I couldn't stand still. My feet moved of their own accord, slowly at first, then faster, until I was running. The ground beneath me warped with every step, the sky above distorted, bending into strange shapes, as if the very fabric of reality were collapsing. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. I ran, my feet pounding against the shifting ground beneath me. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a cacophony of distorted sounds that clawed at my mind. The figures in the distance were closing in, their movements quick and erratic, like something not entirely human. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body aching from the unnatural pull of this place. There was no escape. I could feel it, feel the heavy, oppressive presence of this world weighing on me, bending me, breaking me. Then, in the midst of my frantic flight, I saw it. The orb, its eerie glow was unmistakable, faint now, but still there. Floating in the distance, suspended in midair, as if mocking my every attempt to flee. I could feel it calling me again, tugging at the deepest part of me, the part that knew all too well the price of touching it. I stumbled toward it, the ground beneath me warping with every step. But something felt different now. It was no longer just a portal or a simple phenomenon, it was something much darker, something much worse. As I drew closer, my vision began to swim, and the air grew thick, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with my heart. And then, in that moment of frozen clarity, I understood. The orb wasn't just a portal. It wasn't merely a passage to another dimension or a trick of reality. It was a prison, a trap. The light that emanated from it wasn't an invitation, it was a beacon. A beacon for the lost, for those who dared to approach it, to touch it, to feel its warmth and light. I had been one of them. A fool, like the others before me. And then I saw it. A flash of movement, something shifting within the orb's light, something more than light. It was a face, a twisted, distorted face, its features contorted in agony, stretched beyond recognition. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I realized the truth. It wasn't just a place that trapped you. It was the orb itself that did. And the beings trapped within it weren't some alien creatures or ancient forces, they were the people who had come before me. Those who had touched the orb, only to be pulled into it, locked within the glowing sphere, trapped in that eternal prison. Their souls, their very essence, were now part of the orb. Their faces, their eyes, their voices, they were all remnants of those who had vanished, never to return. And they were watching me now. Watching, waiting for me to join them. The figure in the orb, its mouth opened, stretching wide, as if to scream, but there was no sound. It didn't need to scream. The agony was embedded in its very form, an eternal torment, an unending scream that would never cease. It was trapped, just like me. Trapped by the orb, bound to it by their own curiosity, their own desperation. And that was the horror. The orb didn't just transport you. It consumed you. Every person who touched it was swallowed whole, their bodies, their souls, absorbed into the light. They didn't just disappear. They became part of it, part of the field, part of the orb, part of this nightmarish dimension. A sudden, crushing weight settled in my chest as the realization hit me like a wave of cold steel. There was no going back. There was no way out. I wasn't just running from this place. I was running toward it, toward my own inevitable fate. I turned, desperation clawing at my throat, and looked back toward the shadows moving closer. The figures weren't just shadows. They were us. They were the ones who had been here before me, the ones who had already been consumed by the orb. Their faces were still contorted in fear, their eyes still wide with terror, frozen in time, forever lost to this world. And now I was one of them. The terror that gripped me was like nothing I had ever felt before. It wasn't the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the fear of the inevitable. I knew what was coming. I knew that the orb would claim me, just as it had claimed everyone else. I turned again, trying to make my way back to the orb. I could feel it, the pull, the cold grasp of inevitability, drawing me back. There was no choice, no chance to resist. My body was already giving in, my mind unraveling. As I reached the orb, the world around me began to fragment. The faces of the trapped souls, their eyes wide with pain, stared at me from the glow. I was no longer sure if I was still in my own body, or if I had already been absorbed by the orb, lost to it like the others before me. The whispers became louder, frantic, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I had never really left this place. The orb had always been waiting for me. And now, it had claimed me. The final revelation hit me harder than anything else. I wasn't escaping this world. This world was me. And now, there was no way to break free. The orb pulsed again, its light blinding, its hum reverberating deep inside me. The whispering voices were louder now, no longer just distant murmurs in the wind, but clear, urgent calls, pulling me toward the inevitable. The figures in the distance were closer, no longer shadows, but fully formed, faces twisted in eternal dread, their eyes wide, locked in terror. As I gazed at them, their features became familiar, but they were not people I recognized. They were like me. Like all of us. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I could feel the cold grip of realization slowly suffocating me, and my body grew heavy, as though I was sinking deeper into the very ground I stood on. The air was thick with dread, and I could hear my own heart hammering in my chest, drowning out everything else. I knew what had happened to them. I knew what would happen to me. The truth was unmistakable, searing through my mind like a burning brand. These figures, these tortured souls, weren't just lost. They were trapped. They had once been like me, foolish enough to touch the orb, drawn in by its seductive glow, only to be swallowed whole, trapped in this endless field. Forever. And now, it was my turn. I couldn't move. My legs refused to carry me, as though the weight of my understanding had rooted me in place. The figures drew closer still, their hollow eyes meeting mine with an unspoken understanding. Their mouths opened, but no sound came, only the oppressive silence of the field, broken only by the hum that surrounded me. They weren't just watching, they were waiting for me to join them. I turned toward the orb, its glow brighter than ever, and for a moment, I felt its pull stronger than I had ever felt before. It wasn't just the orb calling me. It was the field. The very ground beneath me seemed to beckon, its pulsating rhythm matching the thudding of my heart. I felt like I was sinking into it, as if it were pulling me in from all directions, suffocating me, wrapping around me like a web of darkness, pulling me deeper into its endless void. The realization hit me again, this time with full force. The field was not just a place. It was a trap. A never-ending cycle that claimed those who dared to touch the orbs, claiming their souls and forcing them to walk this cursed land for eternity. The figures were no longer human. They were fragments of the past, echoes of those who had come before me, and now they were nothing but shells of the people they once were. And soon, I would be one of them. The cold panic that had been gnawing at me exploded into full-blown terror. I wasn't just standing on the edge of this nightmare, I was already inside it. The orb wasn't a portal to another dimension, it was a gateway to oblivion, and I had already passed through it. The people, the figures, the faces, they were not separate from me. They were me. They were who I had become, and soon, I too would be trapped in this endless cycle, condemned to wander the field forever. I looked around, my vision blurring, the edges of the world warping and twisting. The air grew heavier, colder. The figures were nearly upon me now, their eyes hollow, staring at me with a mix of pity and horror. They had accepted their fate long ago. But I couldn't. Not yet. I tried to take a step back, but it was futile. The ground beneath me shifted and contorted, pulling at my feet, dragging me deeper into the field. I felt my body weaken, my energy draining away as the pull of the orb intensified, drawing me back to it. I could feel it, cold and merciless, like a force greater than anything I had ever known. The figures had stopped moving now. They stood in place, their eyes never leaving mine, watching as I was consumed by the same fate they had suffered. And I realized with a sickening finality that it was no longer about escaping or finding a way out. There was no way out. There was no escape from the field. I had become part of it. And in time, I would fade into the very fabric of this endless nightmare. My soul would be claimed, just like all the others, and I would walk this cursed land, my face twisted in the same agony, my eyes filled with the same terror, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to touch the orb and join us. The hum of the field grew louder, drowning out all other thoughts, until it was the only thing that existed. It was not just the sound of the orb, not just the sound of the figures. It was the sound of everything, pulling me into its eternal grip. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I opened my mouth, but the only thing I could hear was the hum, growing louder and louder, drowning everything out. And then, I was no longer me. I was nothing. Just another figure in the field, lost forever. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound never came, only a hollow emptiness echoed in my throat. The field around me stretched infinitely, as though the very air was alive with some dark purpose. The orb, pulsing with a bright, unnatural glow, dominated the horizon, casting an eerie light over the endless expanse. The figures, no, the lost souls, had gathered around me now, circling like shadows, their eyes vacant yet full of something unspeakable. They had been here so long, had lived through this curse for what felt like eternity, and now I, too, was one of them. I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the shifting ground beneath me, and in that moment, the weight of it all crushed me. Every soul, every face, was a reminder of what I had become, what I had let myself be drawn into. The orb shone brighter, and the hum that filled the air grew louder, overwhelming my thoughts, drowning out my mind, until there was only the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the void. It was a rhythmic, maddening thrum, in tune with the glowing orb, as if the very universe itself was pulsing with it. Then, without warning, the air around me cracked, and I felt a sharp tug, a force pulling me toward the orb, the glowing light swallowing everything else in its wake. The other figures, now nothing but twisted echoes of their former selves, seemed to nod, their faces frozen in eternal agony as if they had known this was coming. My feet dragged against the ground as the orb's pull became more intense, forcing me forward, deeper into its light. The faces of the trapped souls blurred as the world warped around me, reality twisting until I could no longer make sense of where I was, or who I was. All that remained was the relentless pull of the orb, and the knowledge that there would be no escape. My body grew weaker, my vision narrowing to nothing but the blinding light of the orb. I could feel myself slipping away, my existence fading into the darkness of the void. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was my own scream, rising from deep within me, shattering the air around me like broken glass. And then, everything went black. The scream didn't fade. It echoed, carried by the wind that swept through the endless field, bouncing from one shadowed soul to the next. The orb pulsed brighter than ever, and in that moment, I understood. It wasn't over. It never would be. The field had claimed me, as it had claimed all who came before. And now, as the orb drew in yet another soul, I became one more whisper in the dark, one more lost soul trapped in the endless, pulsing void forevermore. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.